Part 3. To the Best of My Ability. Chapter 9. The Moon, the Stars, and All the Planets. So ended an era, and so began another. Alan Drury. 1. The news broke at 5:47 p.m. Eastern Wartime, April 12, 1945. International News Service was first on the wire, followed seconds later by the Associated Press, United Press, the 4 radio networks, and the Armed Forces Radio Service. In New York, CBS interrupted a children's serial about Daniel Boone called Wilderness Road. NBC broke into Front Page Feral, ABC interrupted Captain Midnight, and Mutual, Tom Mix. In minutes, the bulletin had reached every part of the country and much of the world. The time in London was near midnight. In Berlin, where it was already another day, Friday the 13th, an ecstatic Joseph Goebbels, Nazi propaganda minister, telephoned Hitler personally to proclaim it a turning point written in the stars. In Moscow, the American ambassador, Averell Harriman, was hosting an embassy party when a duty officer called to report what he had heard on a late broadcast on the Armed Forces Radio Service. At the Armed Forces radio station in Panama, Sergeant James Weathers, assigned to answer incoming calls, began picking up the phone and answering, "Yes, it's true. Yes, it's true," over and over again. Franklin Roosevelt had died of a cerebral hemorrhage at the Little White House in Warm Springs, Georgia, at 4:45 in the afternoon, 3:45 Warm Springs time. 2 hours earlier, sitting at a card table signing papers, he had complained of a terrific headache, then suddenly collapsed, not to regain consciousness. As many accounts state, his death at age 63 came in an hour of high triumph. The armies and fleets under his direction as Commander-in-Chief were at the gates of Berlin and the shores of Japan's home islands, and the cause he represented and led was nearing the conclusive phase of success. From the White House, Mrs. Roosevelt sent cables to her 4 sons in the service, saying their father had done his job to the end, as he would want them to do, a point Steve Early included in the initial White House announcement. To Early and Harry Truman she had also expressed a wish to fly to Warm Springs, but questioned whether it would be proper now for her to use a government plane. Truman unhesitatingly said she should. This and the arrival of Secretary of State Stettinius were among the few things he would remember from the scene in her study. Stettinius had appeared in the doorway, with tears streaming down his face. They agreed the cabinet should be assembled at once, and the Chief Justice summoned to administer the oath of office. Truman started downstairs for the West Wing. From the President's office he telephoned Les Biffle. He wanted the congressional leadership to come at once, and a car sent for Mrs. Truman and Margaret. He then called the apartment and told Bess what had happened. She had not had the radio on. It was the first she had heard. The West Wing throbbed with activity and tension. Reporters, photographers, White House staff people, the Secret Service, and a few of Truman's own staff converged from several directions, crowding corridors and offices. Voices were hushed and tense. Telephones kept ringing. In the twilight outside, across Pennsylvania Avenue, in Lafayette Square, thousands of people gathered in silence. By 7 o'clock, nearly everyone who was supposed to be there had assembled in the cabinet room. Stettinius and Chief Justice Harlan Stone, Sam Rayburn, John McCormick, Joe Martin, Henry Stimson, Henry Wallace, Harold Ickes, Attorney General Francis Biddle, Secretary of Agriculture Claude Wickard, Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, Julius Krug, War Production Board Administrator, Fred M. Vinson, Director of the Office of War Mobilization, Admiral William Leahy, who was Roosevelt's personal Chief of Staff, Bob Hannigan, and Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins, the only woman present until the arrival of Bess and Margaret. Missing were Postmaster General Frank Walker, who was ill, and Alban Barkley, who had decided to stay with Mrs. Roosevelt. Uniformed White House guards were at the doors. Truman sat by himself in a brown leather chair, looking dreadful, absolutely dazed. When Bess came in, he crossed the room and took her hand. Little was said by anyone. Then, for what seemed an extremely long time, they all stood waiting while several of the staff went in search of a Bible. It was a very somber group, Stimson would record. Bess, who had been crying almost from the moment she heard the news, dabbed repeatedly at her eyes with a handkerchief. Margaret would remember feeling as if she were going under anesthesia. None of it seemed quite real. The only Bible to be found was an inexpensive Gideon edition with garish red edging to the pages. It had been in the desk drawer of the fastidious head usher, Howell Krim, a short-stooped, bald-headed man who now made sure it was properly dusted before placing it on the table. Truman would later tell his mother he could have brought Grandpa Truman's Bible from his office bookcase had he only known. He and Justice Stone took their places by the marble mantelpiece at the end of the room beneath the portrait of Woodrow Wilson. Bess, Margaret, and the others filed in around them. A few reporters, photographers, and newsreel cameramen were told to come in. One of the staff recalled much milling about and confusion. The time on the clock on the mantel was 7:09, 2 hours and 24 minutes since Roosevelt's death. Truman glanced at the clock. "It said 7:09 when I started to swear the oath. I remember," he later said. "I looked at it, and I remember the faces all around me." He picked up the Bible and held it in his left hand. He raised his right hand. "I, Harry Ship Truman," Justice Stone began. "I, Harry S. Truman," Truman corrected him, "do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States, and will to the best of my ability preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help you God," added the Chief Justice. "So help me God." His sharp features taut, as a reporter noted, Truman looked straight ahead through his thick round glasses. The sudden, fervent way he kissed the Bible at the end of the ceremony impressed everyone present. It had all taken not more than a minute. Afterward he asked the cabinet to remain. They were assembled about the table when Steve Early came in to say the press would want to know if the San Francisco Conference on the United Nations would open as planned in 12 days, on April 25th. As several in the room knew, Roosevelt had often sat alone at the same table, looking at the Wilson portrait, pondering the tragedy of Wilson's failure to create the League of Nations. The answer was emphatically yes, Truman said, making his first decision as president. In his brief remarks to the cabinet, he said he intended to carry on with Roosevelt's program and hoped they would all stay on the job. He welcomed their advice. He did not doubt that they would differ with him if they felt it necessary, but final decisions would be his, and he expected their support once decisions were made. Stimson, the senior member, said it was time to close ranks. When the meeting ended, Stimson remained behind. It was a matter of utmost urgency to be discussed, he told Truman. It concerned a new explosive of unbelievable power. But he gave no further details, which left Truman no better informed than before. In his diary later that night, Stimson wrote that the new president had conducted himself admirably, considering the shock he had been through and how little he knew. Truman, before leaving for home, remembered that Eddie McKim was in town and that they had a date to play poker that night at McKim's room at the Statler. "I guess the party's off," Truman said, once the White House operator had McKim on the line. By 9:30 he was back at 4701 Connecticut Avenue. Bess, Margaret, and Mrs. Wallace, he found, had gone to the apartment of neighbors next door, a general named Davis and his wife, where they were lingering over the remains of a turkey and cake. Margaret remembered her father saying little except that he had had nothing to eat since noon. Mrs. Davis fixed him a turkey sandwich and a glass of milk. Shortly, he excused himself, went to the apartment, and called his mother to tell her he was all right and not to worry. He then went to bed and, he later said, immediately to sleep. Automobile traffic and streetcars passed beneath his open window as though nothing were different. People walking by took no more interest in the building than on other nights. Other residents, coming or going, some with dogs on leashes, were surprised to find reporters in the lobby and Secret Service men standing about. The reporters had taken over 2 couches beside a stone fireplace. In a corner was the telephone switchboard for the building and a bank of mailboxes. Box 209 carried a printed card, Mr. and Mrs. Harry S. Truman, with Margaret Truman handwritten in ink below. The switchboard operator said she regretted very much that the Trumans would be leaving. "Such lovely people," she said. A widely repeated story in Washington that the switchboard at 4701 Connecticut Avenue was the busiest in town that night because news of Roosevelt's death and Truman's swearing in meant there would soon be an apartment available in the building, is apparently apocryphal. To the country, the Congress, the Washington bureaucracy, to hundreds of veteran New Dealers besides those who had gathered in the cabinet room, to much of the military high command, to millions of American men and women overseas, the news of Franklin Roosevelt's death, followed by the realization that Harry Truman was president, struck like massive earth tremors in quick succession, the thought of Truman in the White House coming with the force of a shock wave. To many it was not just that the greatest of men had fallen, but that the least of men, or at any rate the least likely of men, had assumed his place. "Good God, Truman will be president," it was being said everywhere. "If Harry Truman can be president, so could my next-door neighbor." People were fearful about the future of the country, fearful the war would drag on longer now. "What a great, great tragedy. God help us all," wrote David Lilienthal, head of TVA. The thought of Truman made him feel physically ill. The country and the world don't deserve to be left this way. The fact that Roosevelt had died like Lincoln in the last stages of a great war, and like Lincoln in April, almost to the day, were cited as measures both of Roosevelt's greatness and the magnitude of the tragedy. But implicit also was the thought that Lincoln, too, had been succeeded by a lackluster, so-called common man, the ill-fated Andrew Johnson. Stettinius, who as Secretary of State was next in line now to succeed to the presidency, wondered privately if the parallel was not closer to what followed Woodrow Wilson after the last war, if the country was in for another Harding administration, with cheap courthouse politicians taking over. Senators, according to the conventional wisdom, didn't make strong presidents. Harding had been the only other president drawn from the Senate thus far in the century, and the feeling was he had been taken from the bottom of the barrel. Theodore Roosevelt, Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, even Coolidge had all been governors, and governors from experience knew something about running things. In a house at Marburg, Germany, 3 American generals, Eisenhower, Bradley, and Patton, sat up much of the night talking about Roosevelt and speculating on the sort of man Truman might be. All 3 were greatly depressed. From a distance, Truman did not appear at all qualified to fill Roosevelt's large shoes, Bradley wrote. Patton was bitter and more emphatic. "It seems very unfortunate that in order to secure political preference, people are made vice president who are never intended, neither by party nor by the Lord, to be presidents." It had been an unusually difficult day for the 3 commanders, even before the news about Roosevelt. They had seen their first Nazi death camp, Ohrdruf Nord, near Gotha. As they bid good night to one another, an aide recalled Eisenhower looking deeply shaken. For thousands of men in the ranks, as for many at home, the question was not so much was Truman qualified, as who was he? In the chill of dawn in Germany, a private named Lester Atwell remembered his battalion had been lined up for breakfast beside a country road. "Men," an officer came quickly along the line, "I have an announcement to make. President Roosevelt died last night." "What?" You heard it from all sides. "What? President Roosevelt? Roosevelt's dead?" We were astounded. The officer's voice continued. "We don't know any particulars except that he's dead. I think it was very sudden, probably a stroke. Truman, the vice president, will take over." "Who? Who'd he say?" "Truman, you dumb bastard. Who the hell you think?" There were some, however, who, facing the prospect of a Truman presidency, felt confident the country was in good hands. They knew the man, they said. They understood his origins. They had seen how he handled responsibility and knew the inner resources he could draw on. As before and later in his life, confidence in Harry Truman was greatest among those who knew him best. "Truman is honest and patriotic and has a head full of good horse sense. Besides, he has guts," wrote John Nance Garner to Sam Rayburn, who was himself assuring reporters that Truman would make a good, sound president. "By God, because he's got the stuff in him." To arch Republican Arthur Vandenberg, writing the night of April 12th, Truman was a grand person with every good intention and high honesty of purpose. Could Truman swing the job? Vandenberg speculated in his diary. "I think he can." Asked years later what his feelings were when he realized Truman was president, John J. McCloy, the Assistant Secretary of War, said, "Oh, I felt good, because I knew him. I knew the kind of man he was." Assistant Secretary of State Dean Acheson wrote to his son in the Navy that as a consequence of a long recent meeting with Truman, he had a definite impression. He was straightforward, decisive, simple, entirely honest. He, of course, has the limitations upon his judgment and wisdom that the limitations of his experience produce, but I think that he will learn fast and will inspire confidence. It seems to me a blessing that he is the president and not Henry Wallace. Even I.F. Stone of The Nation, long an outspoken Wallace supporter, would write, "I hate to confess it, but I think Mr. Roosevelt was astute and far-sighted in picking Mr. Truman rather than Mr. Wallace as his successor. At this particular moment in our history, Mr. Truman can do a better job." At home in Independence, editor William Southern wrote in the Examiner that the country was in the hands of an honorable man, not just a politician. Among such old faithfuls as Eddie McKim, Ted Marks, John Snyder, Jim Pendergast, and Eddie Jacobson. There was never a doubt. "Get in there and pitch. You can handle it," Jim Pendergast cabled immediately from Kansas City. "I wish people knew him as I do," Eddie Jacobson told a reporter. At Grandview a day or so later, questioned by reporters, the mother of the new president offered as fair and memorable a comment as any. "I can't really be glad he's president because I am sorry President Roosevelt is dead. If he had been voted in, I would be out waving a flag, but it doesn't seem right to be very happy or wave any flags now. Harry will get along all right." Truman was immensely pleased and proud of her. Her statement was a jewel, he wrote in his diary. If it had been prepared by the best public relations advisers, it could not have been better. Only gradually would he reveal his own feelings, making plain that if anyone was stunned by the turn of fate or worried over the future or distressed by the inadequacies of the man stepping into the place of Franklin Roosevelt, it was Harry Truman. At the White House, the difference was felt at once. Arriving at 9 the next morning at the West Wing, where a cluster of reporters were waiting, Truman stepped from the big White House Cadillac, followed by Tony Vaccaro of the Associated Press. Vaccaro had gone early to the Connecticut Avenue apartment. He had been standing alone on the curb outside the building, hoping to catch a glimpse of the new president as he started off for his first day. Truman told him to hop in if he wanted a ride. "There have been few men in all history the equal of the man into whose shoes I am stepping," Truman had said as they headed downtown. "I pray God I can measure up to the task." It was Friday, April 13th, 1945, 27 years to the day since he landed at Brest as a first lieutenant in the American Expeditionary Force. In the president's office, everything was as Roosevelt left it, the arrangement of furniture, his ship models, his naval prints on the apple-green walls. Only the desk had been touched, cleared of its pictures and knickknacks by Jonathan Daniels of the Roosevelt staff, who stood by waiting now as Truman came in. He felt the presence of Roosevelt acutely, Truman later wrote, and so did Daniels, whose personal ties to Roosevelt went back to World War I, when his father, Josephus Daniels, the Secretary of the Navy, had been Roosevelt's boss. "It seemed still Roosevelt's desk and Roosevelt's room," Daniels remembered. "It seemed to me, indeed, almost Roosevelt's sun which came in the wide south windows and touched Truman's thick glasses." He watched as Truman sat in the president's high-backed leather chair, rolled back and forth, turned, leaned back as if testing it, and he thought how pathetically undersized Truman looked. The first visitor was Eddie McKim. "Eddie, I'm sorry as hell about last night," Truman greeted him, getting up from the desk. McKim, who was extremely nervous and straining at formality, felt he must remain standing as Truman sat down again. He didn't know what to do in front of a president, McKim blurted. Truman told him to come over and have a chair. When McKim remarked that he would be heading home that afternoon, Truman asked him to stay on, saying, "I need you." He saw Secretary Stettinius twice, for 45 minutes that morning and again at the end of the day. At the conclusion of the morning meeting, Truman asked Stettinius for a written report summarizing diplomatic problems in Europe and said he wanted it by the close of business. Stimson, Marshall, Leahy, Forrestal, and Admiral Ernest J. King came in about an hour before noon to sketch in general terms the status of the war. And beginning about 3 o'clock, he talked about everything from Tehran to Yalta, everything under the sun, with Jimmy Burns, who had flown in from Spartanburg, South Carolina, the night before as soon as he heard the news. The White House was in a state of chaos, meanwhile. Several of the Roosevelt staff had been up all night making arrangements for the funeral. Reporters jammed the press room and lobby. The president was granting no interviews, they were told, yet apparently the president was taking almost any out-of-town call from friends. Once Burns departed, the door was opened to Roy Roberts of the Kansas City Star, who squeezed his immense bulk into one of the maple armchairs beside the president's desk, to carry on a half-hour conversation that resulted in a widely syndicated article in which Roberts made much of the fact that Truman was the typical average American. "What a test of democracy if it works," he wrote. But the big surprise of the day came at noon, when suddenly, defying tradition, Truman left the White House and drove to the Hill, saying he wanted to be with his friends. A lunch had been arranged in Les Biffle's office for a select 17 from both parties and both houses, but mostly from the Senate. Truman arrived at the Capitol with full presidential entourage, cars, police, Secret Service, and walked surrounded by armed men down halls where only the day before he had walked free and alone. The lunch was private, reporters excluded. Pale and tense-looking, Truman took a drink and insisted on informality. The meal was salmon, cornbread, peas, and potatoes, and soon most of the group were calling him Harry again. He wanted to tell them in person, he said, that he needed their help in a terrible job. He felt overwhelmed, and he didn't mind saying so. What did they think of an address to a joint session on Monday after the funeral? There was some discussion and indecision. He told them he would be coming and to prepare for it. When, the lunch over, he came out into the hall, still looking tense, a crowd of reporters stood waiting. "Isn't this nice?" Truman said, his eyes suddenly filling with tears. "This is really nice." In his years in the Senate, he had made no enemies among the working press. Reporters liked him. He was relaxed, easy with them, liked them individually, considered several real friends. "Boys, if you ever pray, pray for me now. I don't know whether you fellows ever had a load of hay fall on you, but when they told me yesterday what had happened, I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." For just a moment he had taken us into his confidence, wrote Alan Drury, and shown us frankly the frightening thing that had happened to him. Shown us, who represented something, a free and easy camaraderie and naturalness, to which he knew he could never for the rest of his life quite return. Also, for a new untried president to have come to the Hill in such fashion seemed an auspicious first move. Characteristically, he came to them. He did not this first time ask them to come to him, wrote Drury. To Republican Arthur Vandenberg, Truman's surprise appearance on the Hill marked an end to years of executive contempt for Congress under Roosevelt. But among Roosevelt's people, the reaction was altogether different, as Jonathan Daniels recorded. They took it as a sign of regression, from a strong, independent presidency to a lonely, perhaps subservient one. Daniels himself felt crushed and resentful, anything but admiring of Truman. Signing his first official document late the afternoon of his first day, a proclamation announcing Roosevelt's death, he felt strange writing his name, Harry S. Truman, President of the United States. Had he come into the office in normal fashion, there would have been 2 months' grace after Election Day, time in which to get used to the idea and prepare himself. As it was, he had no time. He was president now and would be all the rest of the day, and all night, and all tomorrow and the next day and the next. He had been through the morning papers before breakfast. The war news ran on for pages. 9th Army tanks had pushed beyond the Elbe River, nearly to the suburbs of Berlin. At some points, American and Russian forces were only 75 miles apart. The terrible Battle of Berlin was nearing its climax. In the Pacific, American infantry had landed on Bohol, last of the central Philippines still in enemy control. In one huge daylight raid, more than 400 B-29 superfortresses had bombed Tokyo for 2 hours. As the morning papers reported, the war thus far had cost 196,999 American lives, which, as Truman knew, was more than 3 times American losses in his own earlier war. The new total for American casualties in all categories, killed, wounded, missing, and prisoners, was 899,390, an increase in just 1 week of 6,481, or an average of more than 900 casualties a day. In the Pacific, the cost of victory was rising steadily. And he, not Roosevelt, was responsible now. He was the commander-in-chief of armed forces exceeding 16 million men and women, of the largest naval armada in history, of 10 battleships, 27 aircraft carriers, 45 cruisers, of more planes, tanks, guns, money, and technology than ever marshaled by any one nation in all history, and in the critical last act of the most terrible war of all time. In their report that morning, the chiefs of staff had said fighting in Europe could last 6 months longer, in the Pacific, possibly another year and a half. What would follow? What might peace bring? Relations with Russia were deteriorating rapidly. The State Department report provided by Stettinius was hardly encouraging. Since the Yalta Conference, the Soviet government has taken a firm and uncompromising position on nearly every major question. In Poland, now occupied by Soviet forces, the situation was highly unsatisfactory, with Soviet authorities failing repeatedly to keep agreements made at Yalta. The Russians were trying to complicate the problem by supporting their own Warsaw Provisional Polish government to speak for Poland. There was no exchange of liberated prisoners. Direct appeals to Stalin had had little effect. Until that afternoon, the Soviets had been refusing to send their foreign minister, via Molotov, to the San Francisco conference. Now, suddenly, Stalin had changed his mind, as a gesture in memory of Franklin Roosevelt, a gesture that had been urged on him by the American ambassador in Moscow, Harriman. He would send Molotov, Stalin said, if the new president would request it, which Truman did at once, achieving thereby what appeared to be a first diplomatic breakthrough. But as Harriman himself wrote, the gesture resolved none of the basic difficulties. Churchill and the British government were more apprehensive than ever about Russia. Truman had had no experience in relations with Britain or Russia, no first-hand knowledge of Churchill or Stalin. He didn't know the right people, he didn't know Harriman, he didn't know his own Secretary of State more than to say hello. He had no background in foreign policy, no expert or experienced advisers of his own to call upon for help. Most obviously, he was not Franklin Roosevelt. How many times would that be said, thought, written? Roosevelt had done nothing to keep him informed or provide background on decisions and plans at the highest levels. Roosevelt, Truman would tell Margaret privately, never did talk to me confidentially about the war or about foreign affairs or what he had in mind for peace after the war. He was unprepared, bewildered, and frightened. It is needless to say that President Truman comes into this gigantic assignment under a handicap, said the solemn editorial in that morning's Washington Post. He must pick up the work of a world-renowned statesman who had had more than 12 years of experience in the White House, and we should be less than candid at this grave moment if we did not recognize the great disparity between Mr. Truman's experience and the responsibilities that have been thrust upon him. He was the seventh man to have succeeded to the office after the death of a president, the first having been John Tyler of Virginia, to whom Truman mistakenly believed he was related through his great-grandmother, Nancy Tyler Holmes. John Tyler had replaced William Henry Harrison in 1841, the year Solomon and Harriet Louisa Young migrated to Missouri, and Tyler had set an important precedent by deciding to be president in name and in fact, and not the vice president acting as president, which many at the time thought proper, the Constitution being somewhat ambiguous on the subject. Truman was born during the White House years of Chester A. Arthur, who succeeded to the presidency after the assassination of Garfield, and in Truman's lifetime, two more vice presidents, Theodore Roosevelt and Calvin Coolidge, had become president following the deaths of McKinley and Harding. But with the exception of Andrew Johnson, no vice president had ever succeeded so towering a figure as Franklin Roosevelt. And though Lincoln loomed larger than any president in history, Lincoln had not been a world leader, nor the Civil War a titanic global conflict. Truman felt great division within himself. Like John Tyler, he must be president, act presidential, but could he ever feel he was? "I'm still Harry Truman," he had said several times to different people since 7:09 the evening before. A Pentagon information officer who had been sent to the White House that morning with a statement to the overseas troops for the president to sign was asked to wait in the fish room and would remember always the moment when a small gray man walked in, put out his hand and said, "I'm President Truman," with the accent on the I, as though there might be some other President Truman. On the one hand, he was determined to establish that he was in fact in charge. On the other, he felt the constant, nearly overbearing presence of Roosevelt. He would have a portrait of Roosevelt in his navy cape turned as if facing a storm, hung to the right of the desk, and pointing to it would tell visitors, "I'm trying to do what he would like." Grace Tully, Roosevelt's secretary, complained to friends, "I still can't call that man, Truman, president." But then Truman himself still thought of Roosevelt as president. "He's the only one I ever think of as president," he would write to Mrs. Roosevelt months later. His own favorite president of the century, Woodrow Wilson, had had a brilliant academic career. Herbert Hoover had been a world-famous engineer. Franklin Roosevelt, heir to a great name, had been the popular governor of New York, the nation's richest, most populous state. And who was he, Harry Truman? What qualifications had he beside such men, or so many others in public life who wanted the job? Alban Barkley told Truman he must stop deprecating his ability to carry on. "Have confidence in yourself," Barkley said. "If you do not, the people will lose confidence in you." Sam Rayburn came to deliver stern advice of another kind. "I have come down here to talk to you about you," Rayburn began. "You have got many great hazards, and one of them is in this White House. I have been watching this thing a long time. I have seen people in the White House try to build a fence around the White House and keep the very people away from the president that he should see. That is one of your hazards. The special interests and the sycophants will stand in the rain a week to see you and will treat you like a king. They'll come sliding in and tell you you're the greatest man alive. But you know and I know you ain't." On Saturday morning, April 14th, his second day in office, having decided to make John Snyder a federal loan official, Truman called Jesse Jones, head of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, to tell him that the president had made the appointment. Jones understandably asked if the president had made the decision before he died. "No," snapped Truman. "He just made it now." Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau arrived, intending to ask Truman a number of questions as a way of assessing him. Truman said he did not wish to take up Morgenthau's time. He asked for a comprehensive report on the nation's financial standing and, as with Stettinius, he said he wanted it quickly, demonstrating that he, Harry Truman, was not on trial. Morgenthau was. To Morgenthau, who had not known him, Truman seemed courteous as well as decisive. "But after all, he is a politician," added Morgenthau in his diary. "And what is going on in his head, only time will tell." When the train bearing Roosevelt's body came into Union Station from Warm Springs later the morning of Saturday the 14th, Truman was waiting on the platform beside the Roosevelt family and flanked by the two men who had the most reason to see themselves in his place, Henry Wallace and Jimmy Burns. Truman had asked them to accompany him to the station, knowing the photographers would record the moment. It was a generous, respectful gesture on his part, but seen also as a mark of confidence. Like the lunch at the Capitol, it seemed exactly the right thing for him to have done. The day was extremely warm and muggy, the sun burning through a haze. To the steady beat of muffled drums, the three men in their dark suits rode together in the long, slow funeral procession to the White House. Tremendous crowds stretched the length of Constitution Avenue, waiting to see the caisson and casket roll past pulled by 6 white horses. Never would he forget, Truman wrote, the sight of so many people in grief. At midday the weather changed dramatically, with heavy clouds rushing in and the wind whipping the flags that stood at half-mast everywhere in the city. Then rain came in torrents. At the 4 o'clock service in the East Room, where several hundred had gathered, the Cabinet, Supreme Court, foreign diplomats, the chiefs of staff in uniform, Thomas E. Dewey, Mrs. Woodrow Wilson, not one person thought to stand when Truman entered, nor did he appear to notice. With Bess and Margaret beside him, he sat motionless through the service, staring straight ahead at the flag-draped casket. His schedule had been crowded all day. With the Capitol and the nation in mourning, with the Roosevelt family still in residence, he had wanted no more attention than necessary drawn to activities in the West Wing. No further official pronouncements, nothing until Roosevelt was decently buried. Still, in the time between the return from the station and the East Room service, there had been a steady procession in and out of his office. Harry Hopkins, Ed Flynn, Admiral Leahy, Jimmy Burns. The longest session was with Hopkins, who had left a sickbed in Minnesota to attend the funeral and looked like death itself. Truman asked him how he felt. "Terrible," Hopkins answered. "I knew what he meant," Truman wrote. For nearly 2 hours they reviewed the history of the Roosevelt years, talked about Stalin and Churchill, as the rain beat against the tall windows. Lunch was brought in, and Hopkins pulled his chair up to the desk. There were no eulogies in the East Room service at Mrs. Roosevelt's request. 2 hymns were sung, Eternal Father, Strong to Save, and Faith of Our Fathers. After the final prayer, Bishop Angus Dunn, again as Mrs. Roosevelt wished, read the famous line from the 1933 inaugural address. "Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself." On Sunday morning, April 15th, after a night trip by presidential train, many of the same group were gathered at the graveside in the rose garden of Roosevelt's Hyde Park estate. The weather, mercifully, had turned fair and cool. It was a perfect spring day, the Hudson Valley glorious with spring green, the river sparkling. Truman stood with Bess and Margaret, hat in hand, his head bowed as taps were sounded. 2. The first test was his address to Congress the afternoon of Monday, April 16th, and he passed with flying colors. Indeed, for days, for weeks, he seemed to do nearly everything right. Congress, the press, the public liked what they saw and heard. Even a little mix-up at the start of the speech when Truman began before he was supposed to. He came down the aisle to a standing ovation, went directly to the rostrum, opened a large black loose-leaf notebook, and started in, addressing not just the packed chamber, but an enormous radio audience. Speaker Rayburn leaned forward. "Just a minute, Harry, let me introduce you," he interrupted, his voice coming over clearly on the battery of microphones. In a phone call only that morning, Rayburn had told him, "Mr. President, you are not Harry to me anymore." But in his own excitement, Rayburn had forgotten, and the moment, amusing, poignant, would be recalled for years. The speech lasted just 15 minutes. Speaking slowly and carefully, Truman was interrupted by applause again and again, 17 times before he finished. "With great humility," he said, "I call upon all Americans to help me keep our nation united in defense of those ideals which have been so eloquently proclaimed by Franklin Roosevelt. I want, in turn, to assure my fellow Americans and all those who love peace and liberty throughout the world that I will support and defend those ideals with all my strength and all my heart. That is my duty, and I shall not shirk it." People everywhere felt relief, even hope, as they listened. He seemed a good man, so straightforward, so determined to do his job. The voice and accent would take some getting used to. He pronounced United States as United States, and nation almost as though it rhymed with session. At times I came close to ah, but he sounded as though he meant every word. He would prosecute the war without let-up, Truman said, work for a lasting peace, work to improve the lot of the common people. All of us are praying for a speedy victory. Every day peace is delayed costs a terrible toll. The armies of liberation are bringing to an end Hitler's ghastly threat to dominate the world. Tokyo rocks under the weight of our bombs. I want the entire world to know that this direction must and will remain unchanged and unhampered. Our demand has been, and it remains, unconditional surrender, he declared, his voice rising suddenly in pitch on the last two words, which brought a storm of applause. He spoke of the necessity for a strong and lasting United Nations organization. Isolationism was a thing of the past. There could be no more safety behind geographical barriers, not ever again. The responsibility of a great state is to serve and not to dominate the world. The conservative columnist David Lawrence, watching from the press gallery, wrote that between the man on the rostrum and the audience before him there was a bond of friendship such as few presidents had ever experienced. Much of the speech had been written on the train returning from Hyde Park. Jimmy Burns and Sam Rosenman, author of innumerable Roosevelt speeches, had played a large part. But the conclusion, delivered to a hushed chamber, was entirely Truman's own. His face lifted, his hands raised, in a voice of solemn petition, he said, "At this moment I have in my heart a prayer. As I have assumed my duties, I humbly pray Almighty God, in the words of King Solomon, 'Give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and bad. For who is able to judge this thy so great a people? I ask only to be a good and faithful servant of my Lord and my people.'" The old struggle to determine good from evil, it had been with him for so very long. "I am just a common everyday man whose instincts are to be ornery, who's anxious to be right," he had once told Bess Wallace in a love letter from the farm. The applause, sudden and spontaneous, was such as few had ever heard in the chamber. Senators, members of Congress, old friends, wanted him to succeed in a way they had not felt before. And because he wasn't Roosevelt, he would need all the help he could get. Because he wasn't Roosevelt, it was easier to feel a common bond. The morning after he became president, Republicans in the Senate had filed into their big conference room, number 335, and after passing a resolution of regret over Roosevelt's death, talked of Harry Truman's strengths and shortcomings, and decided it was no time to rock the boat. "He's one of us," reporters were told afterward. "He's a grand fellow. He knows us, thinks like us." Even those inclined to fight him felt obliged to help him get his feet on the ground. "We know how we'd feel thrust into such a job, and we know Harry Truman would be one of the first to help us." Messages of approval poured into the White House. "I was tired of Eastern accents," wrote a woman from Indiana. "Midwestern native good sense meant good things for the future," said a letter from Illinois. "His diction comes out of the wide-open spaces and will find an echo out of these same wide-open spaces," the Washington Post had said. "Your modesty, your humility, your earnestness have captivated the hearts of your American people," a woman in Georgia assured him. "Friend Harry," another letter began, There was heartfelt sympathy for his tremendous burden, his terrible responsibility. He was urged to trust in God, keep his health, get enough sleep, eat right. Labor unions, groups of company employees, veterans organizations, local chapters of the Communist Party, fraternal orders, and church groups pledged their cooperation. One correspondent from Port Jervis, New York, said that while he had never known a man named Harry who really amounted to a damn, he would lend his support anyway. From the Time and Life building in New York, publisher Henry Luce informed Truman that at a meeting of his business friends he had found unanimous confidence in your ability to discharge successfully the great duties of your office in your own way. In Topeka, a doctor who was delivering a baby during the broadcast of the speech stopped to shake hands with the newborn citizen, to congratulate him for making his entrance at so auspicious a moment in history. "May I say," wrote the doctor to Truman, "that in our locality I have never seen such unity of purpose as is manifest toward you and toward the administration you are beginning." And he was a Republican, the doctor said. Every new president had his honeymoon with Congress and the country, of course, but this, the feeling that Truman was one of us, was something more. The day of the speech, the Trumans moved from their apartment to Blair House across Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House to stay temporarily until Mrs. Roosevelt moved out. For several days, his Secret Service convoy keeping step, Truman walked briskly across the street to work at about 8 o'clock every morning. Once a taxi slowed, the driver put his head out the window and called, "Good luck, Harry," as if speaking for the whole country. "Well, I have had the most momentous and the most trying time anyone could possibly have," his mother and sister in Grandview read in a letter written from Blair House the night of April 16th. "This afternoon we moved to this house, diagonally across the street, Pennsylvania Avenue, from the White House, until the Roosevelts have had time to move out of the White House. We tried staying at the apartment, but it wouldn't work. I can't move without at least 10 Secret Service men and 20 policemen. People who lived in our apartment couldn't get in and out without a pass. So we moved out with suitcases. Our furniture is still there and will be for some time. But I've paid the rent for this month and will pay for another month if they don't get the old White House redecorated by that time. My greatest trial was today when I addressed the Congress. It seemed to go over all right from the ovation I received. Things have gone so well I'm almost as scared as I was when Mrs. R. told me what had happened. Maybe it will come out all right." That same day, the Russians had begun their final drive on Berlin, Marshal Georgy Zhukov concentrating 20,000 guns to clear a path. The first press conference, the next morning, April 17th, was the largest that had ever been held in the White House, with more than 300 reporters packed shoulder to shoulder in the president's office, those in front pressed against his desk. The new president made an excellent impression. He stood behind his desk and greeted the correspondents smilingly. He answered their questions directly and avoided none of the queries put to him, recorded another of the Roosevelt staff, a press aide named Eben Ayers. Truman began with the reading of the same wartime ground rules as established by Roosevelt. All off-the-record comments were to be kept in confidence. Background material must remain that only and not be attributed to the president, who was to be quoted directly only when he gave his express permission. With so much to do, Truman said, he expected to be able to hold only one press conference a week. Would he go personally to the San Francisco conference? No. Had he taken any steps to meet with Churchill and Stalin? Not as yet. What about David Lilienthal, whose term as head of TVA was about to expire? He was not ready to discuss appointments. How did he stand on race relations? His record in the Senate spoke for itself. Do you expect to see Mr. Molotov before he goes to San Francisco? Yes. He is going to stop and pay his respects to the President of the United States. He should. Admiral Leahy, who had witnessed so many Roosevelt press conferences, was delighted with the President's direct performance. Truman had already asked Leahy to stay on as Chief of Staff, with the understanding that he, Leahy, would always speak his mind. The old sailor, now past 70, was also known for his direct performance. The applause at the end of the session was unprecedented. To reporters long accustomed to Roosevelt, who made every press conference a kind of circuitous game and charm show, the change was startling and to most extremely welcome. Privately, Truman felt he had lived 5 lifetimes in 5 days. 3 days later, when he called them in again to say his old boyhood friend Charlie Ross was to be the new press secretary, replacing Steve Early, who had retired after 12 years in the White House, the announcement received unqualified approval. Ross had first come to the Capitol as a young reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in 1918, and in 1931 won a Pulitzer Prize for a study on the effects of the Depression. He was widely liked and respected. Steve Early had been hard-boiled. Many reporters were afraid of him. Ross was more professorial and patient, gentle-mannered, soft-spoken. "There is no more beloved or more highly regarded newspaperman in this city than Charlie Ross," said the Washington Post. Hiring Ross had been Bess's idea. Truman had invited him to Blair House, where they talked for 2 consecutive evenings before Ross agreed. He was nearly 60 and understood perfectly how demanding the job would be. It also meant a severe cut in salary, from $35,000 a year at the Post-Dispatch to $10,000. "But Charlie," Truman told him, "you aren't the kind of man who can say no to the President of the United States." Later they had put through a call to independence to their old teacher, Tilly Brown, to tell her the news. The reporters wanted to be sure they had her name right. "Miss Tilly Brown," Truman said. "Matilda Brown. We always called her Tilly." "Was that in grade school?" "High school. She taught Charlie and me English." In her own interview with reporters, Tilly Brown would remember Charlie as a naturally smart boy, while Harry was a bright boy who had to dig. On a first tour of the West Wing offices, Truman was annoyed to find that the half-dozen press photographers who covered the White House were allowed none of the comforts of the press room, but confined to a cramped, windowless space of their own. This was how it had always been, he was told. It was not the way it would be any longer, he said. Photographers were to have the same privileges as reporters, beginning immediately. "He made first-class citizens of us," remembered photographer George Thames of the New York Times, whose first presidential assignment the year before had been to photograph Roosevelt and Truman at lunch under the Jackson magnolia. Reporters found they now had to be on duty at 8 o'clock in the morning rather than 10 or 10:30 when Roosevelt's day had begun. They complained jokingly to Truman of having to get up in the middle of the night to be on time for work. "Stick with me and I'll make men of you yet," he assured them with a grin. Among staff holdovers, attitudes were changing appreciably, almost by the day, the more they saw of him. He was friendly, considerate, interested in them individually. His physical energy seemed phenomenal, and the most startling difference of all from what had been. Lieutenant George M. Elsey, a young naval intelligence officer assigned to the top-secret map room, remembered being astonished by the simple realization that here was a president who walked, and quickly. He was alert, sharp, he looked good, very vigorous, very strong, Elsey recalled. The Secret Service, long accustomed to a president who could move only when they moved him, found themselves suddenly on the go, with a man who could pick up and leave for lunch on the Hill, or anything else he wished, at any moment. With his braces and wheelchair, Roosevelt had been virtually their prisoner. "See, with President Roosevelt, he was a man you had under control," remembered Floyd M. Boring of the White House Secret Service detail. "He couldn't move without you. Now here's a guy you had to move when he moved, and he moved fast. He was a whiz, just like that. He'd go, and went. And you had to go with him. So we had to revise our thinking, and the whole strategy of the place changed because of his ability to be in movement and motion." One day at noon, Truman decided to make an impromptu visit to the Hamilton National Bank, a few blocks from the White House at 14th and G. He simply put on his hat and went out the door, with the result that he created a half-hour traffic jam. The lesson learned was that the bank would have to come to the president, not the president to the bank. Jonathan Daniels, who at first had considered Truman tragically inadequate, began to see him in a new light. Here, Daniels decided, was no ordinary man. The cliché of the ordinary American in the White House was a snob phrase, Daniels would write, invented by those who, after Roosevelt's death, hoped to minimize the presidency. Further, Truman was not poorly prepared for the presidency, as commonly said. Because he knew so much of American life, because he had experienced himself so many of the vicissitudes of all the people, he was really exceptionally well prepared. In time to come, the historian Samuel Eliot Morison would take the same view, calling Truman as well prepared for the presidency as any of his immediate predecessors. It was Truman's too evident modesty that was so misleading, Daniels decided. Asked by the president to stay on a while longer, he gladly agreed. Sam Rosenman, a dedicated Roosevelt advisor, press aide Eben Ayers, David Niles, who had handled minority issues and patronage for Roosevelt, and Bill Hassett, Roosevelt's correspondence secretary, had all, like Daniels, talked of quitting at first chance. Now, when asked to stay by Truman, they too accepted. Bill Hassett, who had been with Roosevelt at the time of his death at Warm Springs, wrote in his diary on Monday, April 16th, "To the White House this morning at the usual time, but with a strange feeling. Impossible to realize that FDR's day was done and another had taken over. The president sent for me. He was very gracious, invited me to remain on the job, frank and forthright in manner. Said that unexpectedly he had been called upon to shoulder the greatest responsibilities, in the discharge of which he would need all the help and cooperation he could get, and added, 'I need you too.' His attitude toward his duties and obligations magnificent." None of the staff, however, thought much of the people Truman was installing. "Missourians are most in evidence," wrote Ayers privately, "and there is a feeling of an attempt by the gang to move in." After a visit to the White House, the journalist Joseph Alsop wrote to his cousin Eleanor Roosevelt in dismay. In Franklin's time it had been a great seat of world power. Now the place was like the lounge of the Lions Club of Independence, Missouri, where one is conscious chiefly of the odor of 10-cent cigars and the easy laughter evoked by the new smoking room story. Eddie McKim, clearly out of his depth, made much of his own importance and on occasion drank too much. Jonathan Daniels thought McKim was weird. Harry Vaughn, loud and jolly, seemed to serve no purpose beyond comic relief. A strange figure named Johnny Maragon, a former Kansas City bootblack who was in and out of Vaughn's office, claiming to be the new head of White House transportation, looked to Eben Ayers exactly like a Prohibition gangster. Hugh Fulton, meantime, bragged of his closeness to the president and the lead part he would be playing in policy matters as the president's speechwriter once things settled down. "We were all a strange lot to them and vice versa," remembered Sam Rosenman. "I had never heard of any of them before they moved in." Only two of Truman's own people appear to have made a favorable impression, Matt Connolly, who would be the president's appointments secretary, and Rose Conway from Kansas City, a shy, industrious little bird of a woman in her late 40s, who had joined Vice President Truman's staff only weeks before, and who would serve as the president's secretary. But McKim would soon be gone. With great regret, Truman told him it would be best if he went home to Omaha. "Well, he was a sergeant in my battery once. I busted him and I can bust him again," Matt Connolly would remember Truman saying. Nor was Hugh Fulton to have a place. As Truman had rid himself of the devoted Vic Messel after his first term in the Senate, so he now sent Fulton packing. Messel's downfall appears to have been some form of financial scheming that Truman found unacceptable. Fulton, it appears, was guilty primarily of sounding his own horn. To everyone's surprise, the long-serving, unquestionably astute Fulton was offered no official post, nothing whatever, and apparently because he had boasted too often and too conspicuously of his own importance. Truman, for all his reluctance ever to fire anyone, could not tolerate what he called Potomac fever, which he described as a prevalent, ludicrous Washington disease characterized by a swelling of the head to abnormal proportions. Harry Vaughn, who struck many as the most miscast figure of the lot, remained as the president's military aide. When Truman made him brigadier general, it seemed to many a bigger joke than the stories Vaughn told. Vaughn would become, to the official family, a figure not unlike Truman's Uncle Harry, a big, voluble, easy-going pal, which gave Vaughn singular importance. Truman seemed to need him around and would tolerate no criticism of him. "I'm still with you, Chief," Vaughn would boom with a grin. Vaughn's stories, contrary to what was said, were not filthy, but more of the barnyard kind. Truman liked earthy humor, but never told stories that had to do with sex, nor did he care to hear them. Also contrary to the popular impression, Vaughn never took a drink. Nobody disliked him, though some worried he could mean trouble down the line. "The fact is," wrote Ayers, "Vaughn, while likable, seems to lack balance and tact and a sense of proportion." In later years it would be said by some who knew Truman well that for him Harry Vaughn was the fool in the Shakespearean sense, the fool who spoke wisdom, who could cut through the obfuscation and insincerity of so much that a president had to listen to day in, day out, who was incapable of posturing or pretense, and whose occasional uncouth moments, the very lack of balance and tact and a sense of proportion that upset people like Eben Ayers, provided not only laughter for Truman, but a way of bringing everyone else back down to earth a little. Truman liked a variety of people around him. He wanted contrasts in style and outlook. It was essential, he thought. The country, after all, was composed of all kinds, and he understood how many Harry Vaughns there were. Importantly, Truman also knew from experience how extremely loyal Vaughn was, and for now he needed all the loyalty possible. When Vaughn brought him some phone taps made by the FBI, a common practice under Roosevelt, and asked if he was interested, Truman glanced at a few pages that concerned the activities of the wife of a White House aide and said that he had no time for such foolishness. "Tell them I don't authorize any such thing," he said. Truman had little use for the FBI and its director, J. Edgar Hoover, in contrast to Franklin Roosevelt, who had liked the way Hoover got results and greatly enjoyed the spicy secrets Hoover passed on to him about the private lives of important people. It had been Roosevelt in 1936 who had quietly ordered Hoover to begin gathering political information, a policy Truman strongly disliked. Truman considered Hoover and the FBI a direct threat to civil liberties, and he made no effort now, as Roosevelt had, to ingratiate himself with Hoover, as Hoover saw at once and found infuriating. Hoover had chosen an FBI agent with a hometown Truman connection, Morton Childs, Jr., one of the big Childs family of independents, to call at the White House as Hoover's emissary, to explain to the president that if there was anything the FBI could do for him, he had only to say the word. But having courteously thanked the young man, Truman told him to inform Mr. Hoover that any time the President of the United States wished the services of the FBI, he would make his request through the Attorney General. From that point on, according to a later account by one of Hoover's assistants, Hoover's hatred of Truman knew no bounds. "We want no Gestapo or secret police," Truman would write in his diary after only a month as president. "FBI is tending in that direction. They are dabbling in sex life scandals and plain blackmail. This must stop." Very likely, Truman's dislike of Hoover had something to do also with the part Hoover and his agents had played in bringing down Tom Pendergast, though he is not known ever to have said so. Vaughn, nonetheless, appears to have thought well of Hoover, or at least to have liked dealing with Hoover behind the scenes. In time, Vaughn would request an FBI phone tap on Thomas Corcoran, the celebrated Tommy the Cork, a former Roosevelt aide and Washington attorney, who was said to know everyone of importance in town and was thought to be working against Truman by leaking denigrating material to influential liberals and the press. Truman disliked and distrusted Corcoran, as Vaughn knew. The justification for the tap was White House security, but it was political surveillance, pure and simple, and as much as Truman disapproved of such practices, and his contempt for Hoover notwithstanding, he gave his consent. The tap, as it turned out, produced nothing of consequence. Still, Hoover would continue to regard Vaughn as his friend at the White House. In his first week as president, Truman signed a bill authorizing payment of $135.67 that for 67 years the government had owed to one Charles Doherty, Sr. for overtime work performed at the Brooklyn Navy Yard in the year 1879. He signed the Mexican Water Treaty that had been before the Senate his last day presiding there. He received his first foreign dignitary, the very elegant British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, who later telegraphed Churchill that the new president seemed honest and friendly, and a delegation of Republican senators who had seldom ever set foot in the executive office in the Roosevelt years. Robert A. Taft, who led the group, had not been to the White House since 1932. George Aiken of Vermont, glad to see so much all-around good feeling for Truman, was sure it wouldn't last. "He'll make enemies sooner or later," Aiken told Alan Drury later. "If he doesn't make enemies, he just won't be a very good president, that's all." He saw Sam Rayburn, Bob Hannigan, Hussein Rajib Baidur, the Turkish ambassador, Sergio Osmeña, President of the Philippines, T.V. Soong, Foreign Minister of China, Georges Bidault, the French ambassador, his own brother Vivian, and Fred Canfill, who took turns sitting in his chair. He was photographed with 3 survivors of the Iwo Jima flag raising: Private First Class René Gagnon, pharmacist mate John H. Bradley, and Private First Class Ira Hayes, and with 5-year-old Margaret Ann Ford, the child of a disabled serviceman, as she pinned a poppy on his lapel to launch a fund drive for the veterans of foreign wars. Between times, he decided to make Jimmy Burns his Secretary of State, and though the announcement would not be made until weeks later, word spread quickly. On Capitol Hill, the feeling was he could have made no better choice. Burns knew the ropes in Washington as few men did. He understood the Senate and the workings of the White House from experience. He knew Churchill. He had met Stalin. Roosevelt had thought him the man best equipped to be president, and as Secretary of State, he, not Stettinius, would be next in line for the presidency, a consideration that weighed heavily in Truman's decision. Sam Rosenman warned Truman that he was making a mistake. Rosenman had become highly cynical about Burns, considered him a man primarily interested in himself. "I don't think you know Jimmy Burns, Mr. President," Rosenman said. "You think you do. In the bonhomie of the Senate, he's one kind of fellow. But I think you will regret this, and if I were you, I wouldn't do it." It was a wonderful relief to preceding conferences with our former chief to see the promptness and snappiness with which Truman took up each matter and decided it. Secretary of War Henry Stimson wrote after a cabinet meeting, "There were no long drawn-out soliloquies from the President, and the whole conference was thoroughly businesslike, so that we actually covered 2 or 3 more matters than we had expected to discuss." Accompanied by Admiral Leahy, Truman went frequently to the map room, which had been established by Roosevelt on the ground floor of the main house as a means for him to follow the course of the war, an idea Roosevelt had borrowed from Churchill, who had a similar arrangement at 10 Downing Street. The low-ceilinged room was under tight security. There were blackout curtains at its single window and large maps covering the walls, these filled with colored pins indicating the latest disposition of ships and armies. To Truman, who had been trying to follow the war on his old World War I maps tacked to the wall of his Senate office, the place was a wonder. Changes in the battle situation were immediately marked as messages came in from commanders in the field, he wrote. Messages came constantly throughout the day and night, so that our military picture was always accurate up to the moment. Leahy was struck by how much world geography and military history Truman knew, and how quickly he absorbed new information. An assistant to the naval aide, Lieutenant William Rigdon, who had been on duty at the White House since 1942, said later of Truman that he never knew anyone to work so hard to get on the inside of all that had taken place. He saw the director of the Bureau of the Budget, Harold D. Smith, who said he would always be bringing him problems. And on Friday, April 20th, he saw Rabbi Stephen Wise, chairman of the American Zionist Emergency Council, to discuss the question of resettlement for Jewish refugees in Palestine. Buchenwald, largest of the Nazi death camps, had been liberated. "I pray you believe what I have said about Buchenwald," Edward R. Murrow had broadcast from the scene. However, a warning from the State Department that the problem of Palestine was highly complex had already crossed Truman's desk. Rabbi Wise, whose appointment was at 11:45, was given 15 minutes only. At noon, Ambassador Harriman arrived. W. Averill Harriman was the son of E. H. Harriman, the little giant of Wall Street, who ran the Union Pacific Railroad and was said to have feared neither God nor J.P. Morgan. The son looked nothing like his father. He was tall, slim, handsome as the man in the arrow collar, as was said, though somewhat cheerless in manner. His low, cultured voice could also lapse into a monotone that some who didn't know him mistakenly took as a sign of low vitality. As heir to one of the great American fortunes, Harriman had grown up in luxury surpassing anything known by his friend Franklin Roosevelt. The Harriman estate on the Hudson comprised 20 square miles, included 40 miles of bridle paths and a stone chateau of 100 rooms. Young Averill had been to Groton, then Yale, and after his father's death was virtually handed the Union Pacific, eventually becoming its chairman of the board. He was an art collector, Cézanne, Picasso, and at one point the country's 4th-ranking polo player. But he was also a tenacious worker who had built his own shipping empire and, at age 40, helped found the immensely successful and respected Wall Street banking firm of Brown Brothers Harriman. Until joining the New Deal, he might have been the model for the kind of man that Harry Truman, with his Jacksonian populist faith, believed to be the root cause of most of the country's troubles, and that Truman had earlier, in the heat of his railroad investigations, castigated unmercifully on the floor of the Senate. Harriman had what his number 2 man in Moscow, George Kennan, called a keen appreciation of great personal power. As ambassador to Russia since October 1943, he was known to work 18 to 20 hours a day. His long, detailed reports were famous at the State Department. In all, he had spent more time with Stalin than had any American or any other diplomat. At the moment he appeared extremely tired and worried. There was a slight tic, a sort of wink in his right eye. Truman had never met Harriman until now, nor had he ever really worked with anyone of such background. Harriman was another new experience, and the first of several men of comparable education and Eastern polish, Charles Bolin, John J. McCloy, James Forrestal, Dean Acheson, Robert A. Lovett, who were to play vital roles in Truman's administration. Even the redoubtable Henry Stimson was as yet to Truman a remote presence. Accompanying Harriman now were Stettinius, Under-Secretary of State Joseph C. Grew, and Charles Chip Bolin, the department's Russian expert. Stettinius made the introductions, but in the half-hour following, he, Grew, and Bolin said very little. Truman asked for a rundown of the most urgent problems concerning the Soviet Union. The Russians had 2 contradictory policies, Harriman began. They wanted to cooperate with the United States and Great Britain, and they wanted to extend control over their neighboring states in Eastern Europe. Unfortunately, some within Stalin's circle mistook American generosity and readiness to cooperate as a sign of softness, and this had led Stalin to think he could do largely as he pleased. Nonetheless, it was Harriman's view that the Soviets would risk no break with the United States. Their need of financial help after the war would be too great, and for this reason the United States could and should stand firm on vital issues. Truman said he was not afraid of the Russians and intended to be firm. And fair, of course. And anyway, the Russians need us more than we need them. Harriman had wondered how much Truman knew of recent correspondence between Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, as well as his own dispatches, and was pleased to find it was quite a lot. Truman had been reading steadily from the map-room files night after night, so much that he feared he might be seriously straining his eyes. Concerns about the Soviet Union had prevailed all through the war, but had taken a more serious cast by the winter of 1944-45, even before Yalta. "I can testify," wrote one State Department official, "that there was no time when the danger from the Soviet Union was not a topic of anxious conversation among officers of the State Department, and by the winter of 1944-45, as the day of victory approached, it became the predominant theme in Washington." In March, Churchill warned that the Yalta agreements on Poland were breaking down, that Poland was losing its frontier, its freedom. Harriman reported that American prisoners of war who had been liberated by the Russians were being kept in Russian camps in unbelievable conditions. At lunch one day with Anna Rosenberg, Roosevelt had banged his hand down on the arm of his wheelchair, saying, "Averill is right. We can't do business with Stalin." In April, an American-British effort to negotiate a surrender of the German armies in Italy brought a stinging cable from Stalin, who accused Roosevelt and Churchill of trying to bring off their own separate peace with the Nazis. Roosevelt, infuriated, had kept his response moderate. "It would be one of the great tragedies of history if at the very moment of the victory now within our grasp, such distrust, such lack of faith, should prejudice the entire undertaking after the colossal losses of life, material, and treasure." Churchill cabled Roosevelt urging a blunt stand against the Russians, and Roosevelt responded, "We must not permit anybody to entertain a false impression that we are afraid." A secret OSS report for the President, dated April 2nd, 10 days prior to Roosevelt's death, a report since made available to Truman, warned that once the war was over, the United States could be faced with a situation more perilous even than the rise of Japan and Nazi Germany. "Russia will emerge from the present conflict as by far the strongest nation in Europe and Asia, strong enough, if the United States should stand aside, to dominate Europe and at the same time to establish her hegemony over Asia. Russia's natural resources and manpower are so great that within relatively few years she can be much more powerful than either Germany or Japan has ever been. In the easily foreseeable future, Russia may well outrank even the United States in military potential. Russia might revert to the predatory tradition of the Tsars and pursue a policy of expansion aimed at bringing all Europe and perhaps Asia under her control," the report warned. "If she should succeed in such a policy, she would become a menace more formidable to the United States than any yet known." Harriman had become so exercised over the state of Soviet-American relations that he had wanted to fly home to Washington even before word came of Roosevelt's death. On April 6th, in a lengthy cable to the State Department, he had said that the time had come when we must make it plain to the Soviet government that they cannot expect our cooperation on terms laid down by them. We now have ample proof that the Soviet government views all matters from the standpoint of their own selfish interest, he declared in another strongly worded report. The Soviet Union and the minority governments that the Soviets are forcing on the people of Eastern Europe have an entirely different objective. We must clearly recognize that the Soviet program is the establishment of totalitarianism, ending personal liberty and democracy as we know and respect it. Roosevelt had undergone a profound change in outlook. Stalin was not a man of his word, he confided to Anne O'Hare McCormick of the New York Times before leaving for Warm Springs. Still, he had refused to give up trying to work with the Russians. In a last message to Stalin sent the day of his death, Roosevelt said that in the future there must be no more mistrust between them, no more such minor misunderstandings as over the German surrender issue. Before passing the message along to Stalin, Harriman had urged the deletion of the word minor, but Roosevelt refused. To Churchill that same day he wrote, "I would minimize the general Soviet problem as much as possible because these problems in one form or another seem to arise every day, and most of them straighten out." He added only, "We must be firm, however, and our course thus far is correct." Harriman told Truman that Russian control in Poland or Romania meant not just influence over foreign policy, but use of secret police and an end to freedom of speech. What they were faced with, Harriman said, using a phrase Truman would not forget, was a barbarian invasion of Europe. American policy must be reconsidered. Any illusion that the Soviet Union was likely to act in accordance with the accepted principles in international affairs should be abandoned. He was not pessimistic, Harriman insisted. He believed workable relations with Russia were possible, with concessions on both sides. Truman said he understood that 100% cooperation from Stalin was unattainable. He would be happy with 85%. Molotov was due in Washington in 2 days. Truman said that if the Polish issue were not settled as agreed at Yalta, then the Senate would very likely reject American participation in the United Nations, and that he would tell this to Molotov in words of one syllable. Harriman told the president how relieved he was that we see eye to eye. On the first inspection tour of the private quarters at the White House, their future home, Bess and Margaret were crestfallen. "The White House upstairs is a mess. I was so depressed," wrote Margaret. The Roosevelts had lived comfortably among possessions, shabby and fine, old, new, ordinary, and sentimental, with little concern for color harmony or ever any attempt at show. They had lived as they had at home, like an old-fashioned country gentleman's family of comfortable circumstances. Mrs. Roosevelt had left untouched the $50,000 allocated by Congress for upkeep and repair on the house. Her focus was on other concerns. Carpets were threadbare. Walls looked as if they hadn't been cleaned in years and were covered with lighter patches where pictures had hung. The scant remaining furniture was in sad disrepair. Some of the draperies had actually rotted. It looked like a ghost house, remembered the assistant head usher, J.B. West, who led the tour. Mrs. Roosevelt had told Bess she could expect to see rats. The group that filed into the Oval Office for what was to be a landmark meeting at 2 o'clock the afternoon of Monday, April 23rd, was the same as Franklin Roosevelt would have assembled for the same purpose. There was no one from Truman's old Senate staff, no new foreign policy advisor or Russian expert of Truman's own choice, no Missouri gang, no one at all from Missouri but Truman. They were all Roosevelt's people: Stettinius, Stimson, Forrestal, Marshall, King, Leahy, Harriman, Bolin, Assistant Secretary of State James Dunn, and General John R. Dean, who was head of the Moscow military mission. Molotov was expected shortly. He had arrived in Washington the day before, and he and Truman had already met briefly and quite amicably after dinner at Blair House, where Molotov too was staying. Truman had spoken of his admiration for the part Russia played in the war, and told the Soviet minister he stood squarely behind all commitments and agreements taken by our late president, and would do everything he could to follow that path. It had been Truman's first encounter with a Russian, and it had gone smoothly. But now Stettinius reported the Russians were insisting on their puppet government in Poland regardless of American opinion. Truman remarked that so far agreements with the Russians seemed always a one-way street. If the Russians did not want to cooperate, they could go to hell. Asking for opinions, he turned first to the elderly Henry Stimson, who thought it extremely unfortunate the Polish issue had ever come to such a head. It seemed unnecessary, too hurried, too dangerous. Stimson was greatly alarmed, for fear we are rushing into a situation where we would find ourselves breaking our relations with Russia. The United States must be very careful, try to resolve things without a headlong collision. Forrestal strongly disagreed. The situation in Poland was not an isolated example. The Russians were moving in on Bulgaria, Romania. Better to have a showdown now than later, he said. The real issue, added Harriman, was whether the United States would be a party to a program of Soviet domination in Poland. Admiral Leahy, from his experience at Yalta, was sure the Russians would never allow free elections in Poland, and warned that a break with the Soviet Union over Poland could be a serious matter. Truman broke in to say he had no intention of issuing an ultimatum to Molotov. He wanted only to be firm and clear. Stimson interjected that in their concern about Eastern Europe, the Russians perhaps were being more realistic than we in regard to their own security. From his experience in Moscow, said General Dean, any sign of fear on the part of the United States would lead nowhere with the Russians. Agreeing with Stimson, General Marshall urged caution. His great concern, Marshall said, was that Russia might delay participation in the war against Japan until we have done all the dirty work. Stimson found himself feeling pity for Truman, as he wrote later in his diary. I am very sorry for the President because he is new on his job and he has been brought into a situation which ought not to have been allowed to come this way. I think the meeting at Yalta was primarily responsible for it because it dealt a good deal in altruism and idealism instead of stark realities on which Russia is strong. As the meeting ended, it was clear the tone of American dealings with Russia would now take a different turn. Truman remarked that he would follow the advice of the majority. Indeed, he did, remembered Bolin. A survivor of revolutions, Siberia, purges, and war, Vyacheslav Molotov was one of the few original Bolsheviks still in power in the Soviet Union, his importance second only to that of Stalin. Molotov was tough and extremely deliberate in manner, with never a sign of emotion, not a hint of human frailty except for a stutter. In his customary dark blue European suit with his pince-nez and small mustache, he looked like a rather smug English schoolmaster. Molotov arrived at the President's office promptly at 5:30, accompanied by his interpreter, V.N. Pavlov, and the Russian ambassador, Andrei Gromyko. With Bolin serving as his interpreter, Truman came directly to the point. He wanted progress on the Polish question, he said. The United States would recognize no government in Poland that failed to provide free elections. He intended to go ahead with the United Nations, irrespective of differences over other matters, and he hoped that Moscow would bear in mind how greatly American foreign policy depended on public support, and that American economic assistance programs after the war would require the vote of Congress. Molotov said the only acceptable basis for Allied cooperation was for the three governments to treat one another as equals. The Poles had been working against the Red Army, he insisted. Truman cut him short. He was not interested in propaganda, Truman said. He wished Molotov to inform Stalin of his concern over the failure of the Soviet government to live up to its agreements. According to Bolin's later account, Molotov turned ashy and tried to divert the conversation. Truman said he wanted friendship with Russia, but Poland was the sore point. The United States was prepared to carry out all agreements reached at Yalta. He asked only that the Soviet government do the same. In Truman's recollection of the scene, Molotov responded, I have never been talked to like that in my life. Carry out your agreements, Truman told him, and you won't get talked to like that. By Bolin's account, however, this last exchange never happened. Truman just cut the conversation off, saying curtly, That will be all, Mr. Molotov. I would appreciate it if you would transmit my views to Marshal Stalin. Thus dismissed, Molotov turned and left the room. But whichever way the meeting ended, there had been no mistaking Truman's tone. Even Harriman admitted to being a little taken aback when the President attacked Molotov so vigorously. In retrospect, Harriman would regret that Truman went at it quite so hard. I think it was a mistake. Bolin, for his part, thought Truman had said only about what Roosevelt would have in the same situation, except that, of course, Roosevelt would have been smoother. The difference was in style. When word of what happened reached Capitol Hill, Arthur Vandenberg called it the best news he had heard in a long time. Stimson was gravely worried. There was more the President needed to know. I think it is very important that I should have a talk with you as soon as possible on a highly secret matter, he wrote in a hurried letter to Truman. I mentioned it to you shortly after you took office, but have not urged it since on account of the pressure you have been under. It, however, has a bearing on our present foreign relations, and has such an important effect upon all my thinking in this field that I think you ought to know about it without much further delay. At noon, Wednesday, April 25th, Truman's 12th day in office, the day after Molotov's visit and the same day as the opening of the United Nations Conference in San Francisco, Stimson again went to the White House, but this time alone. General Leslie R. Groves, head of the Manhattan Project, or S1 as Stimson preferred to call it, was brought in a little later through a side door and by way of the ground floor to avoid being seen, and asked to wait in a room adjoining the President's office. General Marshall stayed away entirely, so great was their concern over rousing curiosity among the press. The war and a lifetime of service to his country had taken a toll on Stimson. On doctor's advice, he was now going home for an afternoon nap whenever possible. The first president he had known was Theodore Roosevelt, who made him a New York district attorney in 1905, at the time Truman was clerking in the Union National Bank. When Truman was learning about life on the farm, Stimson had become Secretary of War under William Howard Taft. Coolidge appointed him Governor-General of the Philippines. Hoover made him Secretary of State. By the time Franklin Roosevelt made him Secretary of War again in 1940, Stimson was an elder statesman of 72. A graduate of Yale and the Harvard Law School, a lifelong Republican, Stimson was widely and correctly seen as a figure of thorough rectitude, if a bit old-fashioned and austere. He spoke with a faintly scratchy old man's voice, wore a heavy gold watch chain across his vest, and parted his hair in the middle, the bangs combed forward over the forehead, a style that had disappeared with wing collars. He was also one of the few men ever to admonish Franklin Roosevelt to his face. "Mr. President, I don't like you to dissemble to me," Stimson had once lectured, shaking a crooked arthritic finger. Reflecting on Stimson a few years later, Truman would describe him as a real man, honest, straightforward, and a statesman sure enough. Like Truman, he had no patience with hypocrisy or circumlocution. Like Truman, he was extremely proud of his service in the field artillery in France in 1918, and preferred still to be called Colonel Stimson. He had first learned of S1 in November of 1941, when named by Roosevelt to a committee to advise the President on all questions relating to nuclear fission. Since then, he had overseen every stage of development. He and Truman were alone in Truman's office. Stimson took from his briefcase a typewritten memorandum of several pages and waited while Truman read it. The words were Stimson's own, and the first sentence especially was intended to shock. Stimson had finished writing it only that morning. "Within 4 months we shall in all probability have completed the most terrible weapon ever known in human history, one bomb of which could destroy a whole city." Although the United States and Great Britain had shared in the development of this most terrible weapon, at present only the United States had the capability of producing it. Such a monopoly could not last, however, and probably the only nation which could enter production within the next few years is Russia. Stimson was anything but sanguine. Considering the state of moral advancement in the world, modern civilization might be completely destroyed. When Truman finished reading, General Groves was shown in to present another report of some 25 pages on the status of the Manhattan Project, which Truman was again asked to read. "The President took one copy," Stimson wrote, "and we took the other, and we went over it and answered his questions and told him all about the process and about the problems that are coming up, and in fact I think it very much interested him. He remembered the time when I refused to let him go into this project when he was the chairman of the Truman Committee, and he said that he understood now perfectly why it was inadvisable for me to have taken any other course than I had." Stimson, said Truman later, seemed as concerned with the role of the atomic bomb in shaping history as in its capacity to shorten the war. Stimson asked for authorization to establish a special select committee to study the implications of this new force, and to advise Truman to help him in his decision. Truman told him to go ahead. What questions Truman had asked neither Stimson nor Groves later said, but in a memorandum for his files, Groves noted, "The President did not show any concern over the amount of the funds being spent, but made it very definite that he was in entire agreement with the necessity for the project." Also, according to Groves, Truman had bogged down several times while reading the longer report, saying he didn't like to tackle so much all at once. Groves and Stimson replied there was no way they could be more concise. "This is a big project," Groves told the President. In fact, S1 was the largest scientific industrial undertaking in history, and the most important and best-kept secret of the war. Overall responsibility had been given to the Army Corps of Engineers, with Groves, who had overseen the building of the Pentagon, in charge. It had been launched out of fear that the Nazis were at work on the same thing, which they were, though with nothing like the seriousness or success that were imagined. In less than 3 years, the United States had spent $2 billion, which was not the least of the hidden truths, and one way or other, 200,000 people had been involved, only a few having more than a vague idea of what it was about. That the diligent chairman of the Truman Committee had known so little was a clear measure of how extremely effective security had been. But then neither did General MacArthur or Admiral Chester A. Nimitz or a host of others in high command know what was going on. While the United States and Great Britain shared in the secret and technical scientific details, it was in all practicality an American project, initiated, supervised, financed, and commanded from Washington. Ultimately, it was Franklin Roosevelt's project, his decision, his venture. Without his personal interest and backing, it would never have been given such priority. For Truman, it was thus another part of the Roosevelt legacy to contend with, and again Roosevelt was of little help to him. Roosevelt had left behind no policy in writing other than a brief agreement signed with Churchill at Hyde Park the previous autumn, saying only that once the new weapon was ready, it might perhaps, after mature consideration, be used against the Japanese, who should be warned that this bombardment will be repeated until they surrender. Whether the bomb would work, no one could say for certain. According to Groves, a first test would not be ready until early July. The Washington Star needed to know what the president ate for breakfast: orange juice, cereal, usually oatmeal, toast, and milk, no coffee. Madame Tussauds Wax Museum in London wrote for the president's exact measurements, requesting that the information be transmitted as soon as possible, and his office obliged. Height, 5 feet 9 inches, chest measurement, 42.5, waist measurement, 35.5, size of shoes, 9B, size of collar, 15.5, size of gloves, 8, size of hat, 7 3/8. He addressed the United Nations Conference by radio hookup. A poor speech, it was full of windy, mostly meaningless pronouncements of exactly the kind Truman disliked and would never normally use. "None of us doubt," he said, "that with divine guidance, friendly cooperation, and hard work we shall find an adequate answer to the problem history has put before us." As I.F. Stone observed in The Nation, what Truman would normally have said was, "It's a tough job. I'm not sure we can do it, but we're going to try our best." On the afternoon of April 25th, he went to the Pentagon to talk to Churchill by the transatlantic secret phone. There had been a secret German offer to negotiate, a peace feeler from Heinrich Himmler, received through Count Folke Bernadotte, head of the Swedish Red Cross. Himmler wanted to capitulate, but only to the Western Allies, not to Russians. Obviously, the Nazis would have to surrender to all the Allies simultaneously, Churchill said. "That is right. That is exactly the way I feel. I agree to that fully," Truman responded. He would cable his news to Stalin at once. Taking time out for his own first look at the White House living quarters, Truman moved through room after room at a brisk trot, according to the assistant head usher J.B. West, for whom this was a first chance for a close-up look at the president. West was struck by how large Truman's glasses made his eyes appear. "I had the feeling he was looking at me, all around me, straight through me." On April 27th, 50 miles south of Berlin, American and Russian troops met at the Elbe. A day later came word that Mussolini had been killed by partisans, his body strung up by the feet like a slaughtered pig. On Tuesday, May 1st, Hamburg radio broke the sensational news that Hitler, too, was dead, by his own hand in the command bunker in Berlin. On May 2nd, the day Berlin fell to the Red Army, the president had to call a press conference to say there was no truth to the rumor of a final German surrender, though Churchill kept hinting at peace within the week. The Postmaster General and the Secretary of Labor wished to retire. The Attorney General did not, but Truman wished he would. The Director of the Bureau of the Budget needed more of the President's time. The Secretary of War returned to go over a list of names for the Special Committee on S-1. It would be hard to imagine a president with more on his mind. From Grandview, Missouri, all the while, came a series of memorable letters from Mary Jane Truman, to keep Harry abreast of the trials she was enduring. April 24th, 1945. Dear Harry, we have received so much mail I cannot remember all the details. We try to read all about what you are doing and have kept up pretty well so far. I've lost 7 pounds the last week, but no wonder. Breakfast is the only meal we have had on time since you went into office. Someone called for pictures yesterday of Mama, said he was an artist from Washington. I told him I was sorry, but Mama had had all the pictures she could pose for at present. Mary Jane's recurring theme through much of what she wrote was the considerable disservice he had done to them by becoming president. Of immediate concern was whether he could get home for Mother's Day or whether she and Mama would have to come to Washington, as he had suggested. May 1st, 1945. Dear Harry, I do hope that you can come, but if not, I feel sure we can persuade Mama to make the trip. And please tell me if you have any suggestion to make about what you would like me to bring in the way of clothes, for I want to look my best and also get Mama fixed up all right, too, and it's a pretty large order on such short notice. May 7th, 1945. Dear Harry, I arrived home yesterday and found Mama well and very much inclined to go Friday, if possible. I had planned to go into Kansas City today to get whatever is necessary, but it's pouring down rain and I have lost my voice, so Dr. Graham said I should stay in. Why do such things have to happen when I have so much to do? I am hoping and hoping that I can get everything ready to go Friday. However, you call me Wednesday instead of me putting the call through. If you can, call early as you can, for if I cannot go shopping tomorrow and Wednesday, I don't see how I can get it all done. Understandingly, he wrote, You have both done fine under this terrible blow. The 5-year-long war in Europe, the most costly, murderous conflict in history, ended on May 7th when the German High Command surrendered to the Allied armies. The terms were signed at 2:40 a.m. in a brick schoolhouse at Reims, Eisenhower's headquarters. The surrender was unconditional. Churchill had wanted to make the announcement at once, but Stalin, with the situation on the Russian front still uncertain, insisted they wait. Truman agreed that the announcement would be made by all 3 allies at the same time the following morning, May 8th, VE Day. He broke the news to reporters in his office at 8:30. At 9 o'clock, from the diplomatic reception room where Roosevelt had so often broadcast to the country, he spoke to the largest radio audience yet recorded. This is a solemn but glorious hour. I only wish that Franklin D. Roosevelt had lived to witness this day. We must work to finish the war. Our victory is but half won. In a separate statement, he called on Japan to surrender, warning that the striking power and intensity of our blows will steadily increase, and that the longer the war lasted, the greater would be the suffering of the Japanese people, and all in vain. Unconditional surrender, further, did not mean the extermination or enslavement of the Japanese people. New York, London, Paris, Moscow, cities around the world had erupted in wild celebration, but not Washington, where it was raining and thousands of government workers, having listened to the broadcast, remained at their desks. I call upon every American to stick to his post until the last battle is won, Truman had said. May 8th was his 61st birthday. He had been president for 3 weeks and 4 days. The day before, Mrs. Roosevelt had moved out of the White House and the Trumans moved in, with very little commotion, as he later wrote, except that Margaret's piano had to be hoisted through a window of the second-floor living room. To move Mrs. Roosevelt out had required 20 Army trucks. To move the Trumans from Blair House across the street had required only 1. 3. The Russian situation concerned Truman more than he let on. Patience must be the watchword if there was to be peace in the world, he wrote to Mrs. Roosevelt, knowing that she, like some others, was apprehensive about his approach to the Russians. To Joseph E. Davies, former ambassador to Moscow, he described how he had given Molotov a straight 1-2 to the jaw, but then asked, "Did I do right?" The Russians, Truman told Henry Wallace, were like people from across the tracks whose manners were very bad. Wallace had begun to worry that Truman was reacting too quickly, without sufficient information and thought. Truman had made a sudden arbitrary move to cut back on Lend-Lease not only to Russia but to France and Great Britain as soon as the war in Europe ended. Ships already underway had been recalled. Apparently he signed the order without reading it, going on the word of State Department officials that Roosevelt had approved. It was a serious blunder, and he had quickly to countermand his own order. Some nights he was so exhausted he went to bed at 8. One morning, after staying up much of the night to read the Yalta agreements again, he said that every time he went over them he found new meanings. His sincerity and his desire to do what is right is continually evident, observed Ibn Ayers. In a top-secret telegram sent on May 6th, even before the German surrender, Churchill had urged that the British and American armies hold firmly to their present positions in Germany and Eastern Europe, and not pull back to the occupational line agreed to earlier with the Russians. It was essential, Churchill said, to show them how much we have to offer or withhold. On May 9th, Truman responded, saying, "It is my present intention to adhere to our interpretation of the Yalta agreements." In Germany, this would mean withdrawing from the Elbe back as much as 150 miles, to as far west as Eisenbach. On May 11th came 2 more cables from the Prime Minister, setting forth his anxieties over the Russians and the future of Europe. "Mr. President, in these next 2 months the gravest matters in the world will be decided," he said in the first cable. "I fear terrible things have happened during the Russian advance through Germany to the Elbe," he said in the second. Russian domination in Poland, Eastern Germany, the Baltic provinces, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, a large part of Austria would constitute an event in the history of Europe to which there has been no parallel. It was essential that the Allied armies not withdraw from their present positions until we are satisfied about Poland, and also about the temporary character of the Russian occupation of Germany, as well as the conditions to be established in the rest of Eastern Europe. All such matters, Churchill warned, could only be settled before American forces withdraw from Europe and the Western world folds up its war machines. In a telegram of May 12th, Churchill's tone grew still more alarming. "I am profoundly concerned about the European situation. I learn that half the American Air Force in Europe has already begun to move to the Pacific theater. The newspapers are full of the great movements of the American armies out of Europe. Our armies are also under previous arrangements likely to undergo a marked reduction. The Canadian army will certainly leave. The French are weak and difficult to deal with. Anyone can see that in a very short space of time our armed power on the continent will have vanished except for moderate forces to hold down Germany. Meanwhile, what is to happen about Russia? An iron curtain is drawn down upon their front," Churchill continued, using a new expression for the first time. "We do not know what is going on behind." Both men agreed to the importance of meeting somewhere soon with Stalin, though Truman felt that for domestic political reasons he should not leave Washington until after June 30th, the end of the fiscal year. In the meantime, he would send Harry Hopkins to see Stalin. Writing to an old friend in Independence on May 13th, a month to the day since he took office, Truman said, "It is a very, very hard position to fall into as I did. If there ever was a man who was forced to be president, I'm that man. But I must face the music and try to the best of my ability. You just keep on praying and hoping for the best." Calling on Truman on May 14th to discuss the joint meeting with Stalin, Anthony Eden was struck by his air of quiet confidence in himself. "I am here to make decisions," Truman said, "and whether they prove right or wrong, I'm going to make them." To have a reasonably lasting peace, the 3 great powers must be able to trust each other, and they must themselves honestly want it, he wrote privately. They must also have the confidence of the smaller nations. Russia hasn't the confidence of the small nations, nor has Britain. We have. Then, in frustration, he added, "I want peace and I'm willing to fight for it." To Hopkins, he advised using either diplomatic language with Stalin or a baseball bat, whichever would work. The Hopkins mission had been urged by Bolin and Harriman, who had flown back to Washington from San Francisco greatly distressed that the United Nations Conference was in trouble. Molotov was heading home. Hopkins, it was thought, might succeed in patching things up, since he would be seen by Stalin as both someone who had been close to Roosevelt and who had worked hard all along for a policy of cooperation with Russia. Hopkins could also handle arrangements for the Big Three conference. Though still gravely ill, Hopkins had at once agreed to go. Meantime, accompanied by Mary Jane, 92-year-old Martha Ellen Truman had arrived for her first visit ever to Washington, after her first flight in an airplane, for a first look at her oldest son since he had become president. Truman had sent the presidential plane for them, the same 4-motored silver C-54, nicknamed the Sacred Cow, that had carried Roosevelt to Casablanca, Tehran, and Yalta, and to Truman's delight, Mama was a hit with the Washington press from the moment she stepped from the plane. "Oh, fiddlesticks!" she exclaimed, seeing how many had turned out to meet her. Had she known there would be such fuss, she said, she never would have come. Small and bent, but chipper as a lark, she wore a large orchid on the lapel of a dark blue suit and a blue spring straw hat trimmed with a gardenia. In the car on the way to the White House, Margaret asked Mama teasingly if she would like to sleep in the Lincoln bed. Mama, her Confederate blood rising, said that if that was the choice she would prefer the floor. Truman thought she would be most comfortable in the Rose guest room, where so many queens had stayed, but his mother found the bed too high, the room too fancy. Offering it to Mary Jane, she chose a smaller room next door. She had arrived in time for Mother's Day. She stayed a little more than a week and charmed everyone at the White House. "Oh, you couldn't help but like her," Secret Service agent Floyd Boring would remember. "She was point blank, you know." The second Sunday, a brilliant blue-sky day with the Capitol Dome and Washington Monument gleaming in sunshine, Truman took her for a cruise on the Potomac in the presidential yacht. Working with J.B. West and a Kansas City decorator, Bess was transforming the private quarters of the White House. Rooms were scrubbed, painted, furniture repaired or discarded. New furniture was purchased, mostly reproduction antiques. New curtains and draperies were installed, walls hung with paintings, landscapes primarily, borrowed from the National Gallery. Bess's mother moved in, taking a guest room over the north portico. Rachel Odom from Truman's Senate office, who was to serve both as Bess's personal secretary and as a companion for Mrs. Wallace, was given a room beside Mrs. Wallace. Truman, Bess, and Margaret had separate rooms. Truman slept in an antique canopied four-poster in the president's bedroom, the room Roosevelt had used, just off the large central oval room on the south side, which again, like Roosevelt, Truman would use as his private study. It was in this oval room that John Adams had held the first White House reception on New Year's Day, 1801, and that Roosevelt had met with Bob Hannigan, Ed Flynn, and the others on the steaming July night less than a year earlier to decide who was to be number 2 on the Democratic ticket. Bess had 2 rooms, sitting room and bedroom, adjoining the president's bedroom, while Margaret was across the hall from her mother in a corner room overlooking Pennsylvania Avenue. "My bedroom is pink with antique white furniture, deep pink draperies and white window curtains," Margaret wrote happily in her diary. "It also has a fireplace and mirror, high 25-foot ceilings." She was the first young resident in the White House since the Wilson years and concerned mainly at this point with final exams at George Washington University. For exercise, Truman had begun using the swimming pool Roosevelt had had built on the ground floor. Truman tried to do 6 or 8 laps in his choppy, self-styled side stroke, head up to keep his glasses dry, and hoped to get to where he could swim a quarter of a mile. In the evening before dinner, he and Bess would relax with a cocktail in the so-called sitting hall, but as J.B. West remembered, it took a while for the staff to learn their tastes. On an evening when Bess first ordered Old Fashions, the head butler, Alonzo Fields, a proudly accomplished bartender, had fixed the drinks his usual way, with chilled glasses, an ounce of bourbon each, orange slices, a teaspoon of sugar, and dash of bitters. But the night following she had asked that the drinks not be made quite so sweet, and so Fields had tried another recipe. This time she waited until morning to complain to J.B. West. They were the worst Old Fashions she had ever tasted. She and the president did not care for fruit punch. West spoke to Fields, who, the third night, his pride hurt, poured her a double bourbon on ice and stood by waiting for the reaction as the First Lady took a sip. "Now that's the way we like our Old Fashions," she said, smiling. Fields, a tall, handsome black man, would later say of Mrs. Truman that she would stand no fakers, shirkers, or flatterers, and that the only way to gain her approval was to do your job as best you could. This done, you would not want a more understanding person to work for. J.B. West, who had grown up in Iowa, found her down-to-earth and personable, correct but not formal. He liked her. Like most Midwestern women I'd known, her values went deeper than cosmetics. The president impressed him as someone who knew who he was and liked who he was. And as a family, all 3 were extremely fond of each other. They were essentially very private people who didn't show affection in public, West wrote, but they did everything together, read, listened to the radio, played the piano, and mostly talked to each other. In 12 years, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt had never been in residence in the White House alone. Rarely had they ever taken a meal together. The full staff for the main house, butlers, cooks, maids, doormen, plumbers, carpenters, electricians, gardeners, numbered 32, of whom the highest ranking were the head usher, Howell Krim, the First Lady's social secretary, Edith Helm, and the housekeeper, elderly gray-haired Henrietta Nesbitt, a favorite of Mrs. Roosevelt's, who had charge of the food and who was the only one who appeared to be a problem, since the food was uniformly dreadful. Ira Smith, who was chief of mails, had first come to work as a messenger at the White House in 1897. Samuel Jackson, the president's personal messenger, had begun his duties during the Taft administration, as had John Mays, the head doorman. Truman got along splendidly with them all. In time, he knew everyone's name and all about their families and years of service in the house. If there were guests, he would introduce each of the servants, something none of them had ever known a president to do before. He knew when a stenographer's baby caught a cold, when a White House servant lost a relative, Merriman Smith, White House correspondent for United Press, would remember. He thought it was hilarious when Leroy, the White House leaf-raker whom he knew and liked, fobbed himself off as an important official and was shown a box at Hialeah, Florida racetrack. One story would be told for a long time. On the night of the German surrender, May 8th, Truman's birthday, the head cook, Elizabeth Moore, had baked him a cake. Dinner over, Truman had gone to the kitchen to thank her, and as Alonzo Fields would note, this was the first time a president had been in the White House kitchen since Coolidge, who had been in and out so often it was said he was only being nosy, to see no handouts were being given away. "I always felt that he, President Truman, understood me as a man, not as a servant to be tolerated," Fields would write, "and that I understood that he expected me to be a man." President Roosevelt was genial and warm, but he left one feeling, as most aristocrats do, that they really do not understand one. Harry Hopkins had told Truman he had made a mistake ever asking the Roosevelt cabinet to stay. A president ought to have his own people around him, Hopkins lectured. Now the changes began. Bob Hannigan, to no one's surprise, was named Postmaster General, the traditional reward for a party chairman, to replace the ailing Frank Walker, who had talked of retirement since before Roosevelt's death. Louis Schwellenbach, Truman's old Senate friend and confidant, was to be the new Secretary of Labor, succeeding Frances Perkins, who had been the first to tell Truman she wished to step down. For Secretary of Agriculture, after the resignation of Claude Wickard, he picked Congressman Clinton Anderson of New Mexico. To replace Roosevelt's aristocratic Attorney General, Francis Biddle of Philadelphia, he named a relatively unknown Texan, Tom Clark, an Assistant Attorney General who had run the Criminal Division. Announcement of the changes caused little stir. At his press conference, Truman was asked only if Clark spelled his name with an E on the end. Nor did Truman regret the departures. Walker he thought a decent enough man, but lacking in ideas. Perkins, though a grand lady, knew nothing of politics, and besides he didn't like the idea of a woman in the cabinet. As for Biddle, Truman had never much cared for him. The only sour note was Biddle's removal, which Truman mishandled. He had no heart for firing people. "Not built right, I guess, to man a chopping block," he had once observed to Bess. To avoid a confrontation with Biddle, he had one of the staff contact him by phone. Biddle, greatly insulted, said that if the president wished his resignation, the president could ask for it himself. A cabinet officer should expect no less. So Truman sent for him and admitted he had gone about things the wrong way. He told Biddle he had not wanted to face him. He then asked for his resignation. "The president seemed relieved," Biddle wrote in his version of the scene. "I got up, walked over to him, and touched his shoulder. 'You see,' I said, 'it's not so hard.'" The eventual announcement that Jimmy Burns would succeed Stettinius as Secretary of State brought the number of replacements to 5, half the cabinet. Just 3 of the old New Dealers remained, Wallace, Ickes, and Morgenthau, and the expectation was they wouldn't last much longer. Stimson intended to serve only until the war ended, which left Forrestal as the only one who seemed likely to stay. In surface ways, the new group was a projection of Truman himself. Everybody but Burns was from west of the Mississippi. There was no one who was notably brilliant or colorful or a vociferous liberal. All were good, solid Democrats, all perfectly safe choices. But most important, 3 of the 5, Burns, Schwellenbach, and Anderson, had served in Congress. Truman was determined both to have a strong cabinet to which he could delegate a large part of his responsibilities and to get along with Congress better than Roosevelt had. Even Tom Clark was chosen chiefly on Speaker Sam Rayburn's recommendation. To the regret of Admiral Leahy and other career Navy men, Truman also brought in a reserve officer, another Missourian, Navy Captain James K. Vardaman, Jr., to be his naval aide, an appointment approximately on a par to that of Harry Vaughan. Like Vaughan, Vardaman had stood by Truman when it mattered, in the 1940 Senate race. Like Vaughan, he knew how to amuse the boss. After one poker party cruise on the Potomac in the presidential yacht with Vaughan, Vardaman, George Allen, and John Snyder, Truman wrote in his diary that his sides were sore from laughing. One further appointment, however, was seen as a first sign of genuine political courage on Truman's part. Clearly it was not a case of politics as usual, or politics in the Roosevelt style. With David Lilienthal's term as head of the Tennessee Valley Authority about to expire, Truman was under great pressure from conservative Democrats to dump him. Senator Kenneth McKellar of Tennessee, Old Mac, the craggy, slouched president of the Senate and chairman of the Appropriations Committee, was in a powerful temper, threatening to lead the biggest confirmation fight in memory if Truman dared reappoint the liberal Lilienthal, who insisted on merit rather than patronage appointments at TVA. To avoid trouble with McKellar, Roosevelt had already spoken of naming Lilienthal to another job. Lilienthal, a steadfast, idealistic New Dealer who had been made nearly ill by the thought of Truman taking Roosevelt's place, was called to the White House. It was Truman's impression that Lilienthal had been doing a first-rate job, and Truman told him so. Then, smiling, he asked if Lilienthal was ready to carry on at TVA. If so, he was reappointed. There would be troubles with McKellar, of course, Truman said, but he had tangled with McKellar before. And that was about all there was, recorded Lilienthal, incredulous and thrilled. No talk about what a rap he, as president, was assuming in naming me. No talk such as President Roosevelt had given me about what McKellar could do to disrupt the peace if his wishes concerning me were not respected. None of that. Just there it was. It was an admirable performance. Simple. No mock heroics. Nothing complex. Straightforward. As it turned out, McKellar's opposition had little effect. The nomination was confirmed by the Senate on May 23rd. Earlier, talking with his staff before seeing Lilienthal, Truman had said with a pleased look, "Old Mac is going to have a hemorrhage." Another morning in late May, at their regular 9 o'clock meeting, Truman told his staff he had done something about which there might be objection. He had invited Herbert Hoover to come to see him. He had written Hoover in longhand the night before. The letter was already in the mail, so there was no use trying to stop it. The former president had been persona non grata at the White House since Roosevelt first took office in 1933. Truman thought it was time that ended. He wanted to talk with Hoover, he said, about famine relief in Europe. Also, as he did not say, Hoover was the one other mortal who had ever sat in his place or who knew the feeling of being constantly compared to Roosevelt. Saw Herbert Hoover, Truman wrote in his diary, and had a pleasant and constructive conversation on food and the general troubles of U.S. presidents, two in particular. Things were going so well overall, Truman also recorded, that he hardly knew what to think. "I can't understand it, except to attribute it to God. He guides me, I think." 4. Besides Henry Stimson, who served as chairman, the newly organized, entirely civilian and highly secret Interim Committee on S1 included 8 members, 3 of whom were eminent scientists involved with the project. James Bryant Conant, the president of Harvard, who was chairman of the National Defense Research Committee, Carl T. Compton, president of MIT, and Vannevar Bush, president of the Carnegie Institute in Washington and director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development. Ralph A. Bard was Undersecretary of the Navy and a former Chicago financier. William L. Clayton was Assistant Secretary of State for Economic Affairs and a specialist in international trade. George L. Harrison was the president of the New York Life Insurance Company and Stimson's special assistant on matters related to S1. The 8th man was Jimmy Burns, who had been appointed by the president as his personal representative. The first meeting was held on Wednesday, May 9, 1945, in Stimson's office at the Pentagon. "Gentlemen, it is our responsibility to recommend action that may turn the course of civilization," the venerable Secretary of War began. Meetings followed on May 14th and May 18th. On Thursday, May 31st, the committee convened for a crucial 2-day session, joined now by an advisory panel of 4 scientists actively involved with development of the bomb: Enrico Fermi and Arthur H. Compton of the University of Chicago, Ernest O. Lawrence of the Radiation Laboratory at the University of California at Berkeley, and most important, J. Robert Oppenheimer, head of the Los Alamos Laboratory where the bomb was being assembled. A wide range of subjects was covered at this final session, including relations with Soviets. General Marshall raised the possibility of inviting the Russians to send some of their scientists to witness the first test. Burns objected, expressing a view agreed to by all present, that the best program would be to push ahead as fast as possible in production and research, to make certain that we stay ahead, and at the same time make every effort to better our political relations with Russia. After much discussion, the committee and scientific panel reached 3 unanimous conclusions. 1. The bomb should be used against Japan as soon as possible. 2. It should be used against war plants surrounded by workers' homes or other buildings susceptible to damage in order to make a profound psychological impression on as many inhabitants as possible. Oppenheimer had assured them the visual effect of an atomic bombing would be tremendous. 3. It should be used without warning. Burns went directly from the meeting to the White House to report to Truman, and Truman, according to Burns's later recollection, said that with reluctance he had to agree, that he could think of no alternative. Stimson, in the meantime, had received a long letter that impressed him greatly and that he passed on immediately to Marshall, calling it a remarkable document from an honest man. It was addressed to the President and had come through regular security channels. "I shall take the President's copy to him personally," Stimson wrote in reply, "or through Burns." Dated May 24th, it was from an unknown engineer named O.C. Brewster of 23 East 11th Street, New York, who had worked on uranium isotope separation for S1, but who, since the defeat of Germany, had become tormented over what the release of the energy locked up in the atom might mean for the future. The idea of the destruction of civilization is not melodramatic hysteria or crackpot raving. It is a very real and, I submit, almost inevitable result. In the early stages of the project, like many others, Brewster had hoped it would be conclusively proved impossible. Obviously, however, so long as there was any chance that Germany might succeed at this task, there was only one course to follow, and that was to do everything in our power to get this thing first and destroy Germany before she had a chance to destroy us. So long as the threat of Germany existed, we had to proceed with all speed. With the threat of Germany removed, we must stop this project. He urged a demonstration of one atomic bomb on a target in Japan, but then no further production of nuclear material. I do not, of course, want to propose anything to jeopardize the war with Japan, but, horrible as it may seem, I know it would be better to take greater casualties now in conquering Japan than to bring upon the world the tragedy of unrestrained competitive production of this material. In the name of the future of our country and of the peace of the world, I beg you, sir, not to pass this off because I happen to be unknown, without influence or name in the public eye. The letter reached the White House, but whether Truman saw it is not known. It was, however, returned shortly with no sign of presidential reaction. The one hint of Truman's state of mind to be found in his own hand is a diary entry on Sunday, June 3rd. "Have been going through some very hectic days," is his only comment. Later he would say that of course he realized an atomic explosion would inflict damage and casualties beyond imagination. Actually, no one was very clear on what power the weapon might have. Forecasts provided by the scientific panel for the explosive force varied from the equivalent of 2,000 tons of TNT to 20,000 tons. Estimates by the scientists on how long it might take the Soviets to develop such a weapon ranged from 3 to 5 years, although General Groves personally reckoned as much as 20 years. Stimson was thinking more of the larger historic consequences. At the final meeting of the committee, he had said how vitally important it was to regard the bomb not as a new weapon merely, but as a revolutionary change in the relations of man to the universe. And like O.C. Brewster, he warned that the project might mean the doom of civilization. It might be a Frankenstein monster, or it might mean the perfection of civilization. Ernest O. Lawrence of the scientific panel had forecast the day when it might be possible to secure our energy from terrestrial sources rather than from the sun. But no one knew. On Wednesday, June 6th, Stimson came to discuss the report with the President in more detail. Stimson told Truman he was deeply troubled by reports of the devastation brought on Japan by the B-29 fire raids. He had insisted always on precision bombing, Stimson said, but was now informed by the Air Force that this was no longer possible, since in Japan, unlike Germany, industries were not concentrated but scattered among and closely connected with the houses of employees. As Stimson appreciated, attitudes about the bombing of civilian targets had changed drastically in Washington, as in the nation, the longer the war went on. When the Japanese bombed Shanghai in 1937, it had been viewed as an atrocity of the most appalling kind. When the war in Europe erupted in 1939, Roosevelt had begged both sides to refrain from the inhuman barbarism of bombing civilians. His Arsenal of Democracy speech in December 1940 had had particular power and urgency because German bombers were pounding London. "What a puny effort is this to burn a great city," Edward R. Murrow had said. But the tide of war had turned, and the ghastly dew raining from the skies in the Tennyson poem that Truman still carried in his wallet had become more ghastly by far. That winter, in February 1945, during 3 raids on Dresden, Germany, 2 British raids, 1 American, incendiary bombs set off a firestorm that could be seen for 200 miles. In all, an estimated 135,000 people had died. A recent issue of Life carried aerial photographs taken after 300 B-29 bombers swept such destruction on Tokyo, said Life, as was hitherto visited on the city only by catastrophic earthquakes. The magazine said nothing of how many men, women, and children were killed, but in one such horrendous fire raid on Tokyo the night of March 9th to 10th, more than 100,000 perished. Bomber crews in the last waves of the attack could smell burning flesh. With Japan vowing anew to fight to the end, the raids continued. On May 14th, 500 B-29s hit Nagoya, Japan's third-largest industrial city, in what the New York Times called the greatest concentration of firebombs in the history of aerial warfare. On May 23rd, 5 square miles of Tokyo were obliterated. 36 hours later, 16 square miles were destroyed. As weeks passed, other coastal cities were hit: Yokohama, Osaka, Kobe. Stimson told Truman he didn't want to see the United States outdoing Hitler in atrocities. But he was also concerned that targets in Japan might become so bombed out by conventional raids that S-1 would have no fair background to show its strength, an observation that seems to have struck Truman as so odd, coming on top of Stimson's previous worry, that he actually laughed, then added that he understood. Neither Stimson nor General Marshall was concerned over whether the bomb should be used on Japan, only with how to use it to stop the slaughter as quickly as possible. Stimson's directive to General Groves in 1942 had been to produce the bomb at the earliest possible date so as to bring the war to a conclusion. As Stimson stressed, the committee's role was advisory only. The responsibility for a recommendation to the President was his alone, and he was painfully aware of all that was riding on his judgment. The ultimate responsibility for the recommendation to the President rested on me, he would later write, and I have no desire to veil it. The conclusions of the committee were similar to my own, although I reached mine independently. I felt that to extract a genuine surrender from the Emperor and his military advisers, there must be administered a tremendous shock which could carry convincing proof of our power to destroy the Empire. Such an effective shock would save many times the number of lives, both American and Japanese, that it would cost. The possibility of dropping the atomic bomb on some target other than a city as a harmless technical demonstration for the Japanese had been considered by the committee and by the scientific panel, and it had been rejected. General Marshall had thought initially that the weapon might first be used against such a straight military objective as a large naval installation, and then, if necessary, against manufacturing centers from which the people would be warned in advance to leave. We must offset by such warning methods, Marshall had said, the opprobrium which might follow from an ill-considered employment of such force. But by now apparently Marshall had changed his mind, and besides he was not formally a member of the committee. The scientists were able to propose no demonstration sufficiently spectacular to give the needed tremendous shock. Probably only one bomb would be ready. There were worries it might not work, and that any advance announcement of a supposedly all-powerful secret weapon that failed would be worse than no attempt and only bolster Japanese resolve to fight on. Writing for the scientific panel, Oppenheimer said, "The opinions of our scientific colleagues on the initial use of these weapons are not unanimous. They range from the proposal of a purely technical demonstration to that of the military application best designed to induce surrender. Those who advocate a purely technical demonstration would wish to outlaw the use of atomic weapons and have feared that if we use the weapons now, our position in future negotiation will be prejudiced. Others emphasize the opportunity of saving American lives by immediate military use and believe that such use will improve the international prospects in that they are more concerned with the prevention of war than with the elimination of this specific weapon. We find ourselves closer to these latter views. We can propose no technical demonstration likely to bring an end to the war. We see no acceptable alternates to direct military use." Burns had introduced the further thought that if the Japanese were told in advance where the bomb was to be dropped, they might bring American prisoners of war to the area. Oppenheimer, who supposedly knew the most about the bomb, stressed that the number of people killed by it would be considerably less than in a conventional incendiary raid. Oppenheimer's estimate was that 20,000 would die. Stimson told Truman what the committee had stressed and what all his senior military advisers were saying, that it was the shock value of the weapon that would stop the war. Nothing short of that would work. Okinawa was on Stimson's mind. Okinawa was on all their minds. An attack on the American Armada by hundreds of Japanese suicide planes, the kamikaze, had had devastating effect. 30 ships sunk, more than 300 damaged, including carriers and battleships. Once American troops were ashore on the island, the enemy fought from caves and pillboxes with fanatic ferocity, even after 10 days of heavy sea and air bombardment. The battle on Okinawa still raged. In the end, more than 12,000 Americans would be killed, 36,000 wounded. Japanese losses were 10 times worse, 110,000 Japanese killed, and as later studies show, Civilian deaths on the island may have been as high as 150,000, or a third of the population. We regarded the matter of dropping the bomb as exceedingly important, General Marshall later explained. We had just been through a bitter experience at Okinawa. This had been preceded by a number of similar experiences in other Pacific islands. The first day of the invasion of Iwo Jima had been more costly than D-Day at Normandy. The Japanese had demonstrated in each case they would not surrender, and they fight to the death. It was to be expected that resistance in Japan, with their home ties, could be even more severe. We had had 100,000 people killed in Tokyo in one night of bombs, and it had seemingly no effect whatsoever. It destroyed the Japanese cities, yes, but their morale was affected, so far as we could tell, not at all. So it seemed quite necessary, if we could, to shock them into action. We had to end the war. We had to save American lives. Among some scientists connected with the project, but not party to the committee's discussions, there was sharp disagreement with such reasoning. In early April, Leo Szilard of the University of Chicago, the brilliant Hungarian-born physicist who, with Einstein, had helped persuade Roosevelt to initiate the project in the first place, wrote a long memorandum addressed to Roosevelt saying that use of an atomic bomb against Japan would start an atomic arms race with Russia, and questioning whether avoiding that might be more important than the short-term goal of knocking Japan out of the war. Because of Roosevelt's death, the memorandum was not sent. Instead, Szilard set about arranging an appointment with Truman through a friend and colleague at the University of Chicago's metallurgical laboratory, a mathematician named Albert Kahn, who came from Kansas City and had once, to pay his way through graduate school, worked for Tom Pendergast. A date was made for Szilard to see Matt Connolly, the new appointments secretary, and Szilard went to the White House. Connolly, having read Szilard's memorandum, agreed it was a serious matter. At first I was a little suspicious, he also said, because the appointment came through Kansas City. He told Szilard it was the president's wish that he see Jimmy Burns, and Szilard, who was unaware of Burns's role on the interim committee or that Burns was soon to become Secretary of State, took an overnight train to Spartanburg, accompanied by a University of Chicago dean, Walter Bartkey, and another noted physicist, Harold Urey. The three men saw Burns on May 27th, just days before the crucial last meeting of the interim committee. Reading the memorandum, Burns was at once annoyed by its tone. The true situation, it said, could be evaluated only by men who have first-hand knowledge of the facts involved, that is, by the small group of scientists who are actively engaged in this work. Burns was put off also by Szilard himself, a notably eccentric man of expansive ego. His general demeanor and his desire to participate in policy-making made an unfavorable impression on me, Burns later wrote. According to Szilard, Burns said he understood from General Groves that Russia had no uranium, and that through possession of the bomb America could render the Russians more manageable. Szilard felt certain it would have precisely the opposite effect. According to Burns, what Szilard, Bartkey, and Urey told him about the power of the bomb did nothing to decrease his fears of the terrible weapon they had assisted in creating. Szilard left Spartanburg determined to draw up a petition to the president opposing on purely moral grounds any use of atomic bombs on Japan. Stopping again in Washington en route to Chicago, he saw Oppenheimer. Like Stimson, like so many, Oppenheimer by this time was worn out, his nerves on edge. There were problems at Los Alamos. Detonators were not firing as they should. The work was falling behind schedule. Oppenheimer looked a wreck. He had been stricken with chicken pox and lost 30 pounds. Though over 6 feet tall, he weighed all of 115 pounds. Oppenheimer didn't share my views, Szilard recalled. He surprised me by saying, "The atomic bomb is shit, a weapon which has no military significance. It will make a big bang, a very big bang, but it is not a weapon that is useful in war." To what extent Burns discussed Szilard with Truman, if at all, is not recorded. But in his discussions about the atomic bomb, Admiral Leahy had been assuring Truman that the damn thing would never work. To Leahy, it was all the biggest bunk in the world. On Saturday, June 2nd, after less than a month in residence, Bess, her mother, and Margaret had packed and left Washington by train to spend a long summer in Independence. Madge Wallace was not happy with life in the White House, nor was Bess. "We are on our way home," underlined 4 exclamation points, wrote Margaret, who to her father seemed in a very unsatisfactory humor. "I hope, sincerely hope," he wrote privately, "that this situation, my being president, is not going to affect her adversely." At home, the old house at 219 North Delaware was being patched up and repainted after years of neglect. It would be gray no more, but white now, with Kentucky green trim at the windows, as befitting the summer White House. After only a few nights alone, Truman began feeling desolate and more than a little sorry for himself. The first Sunday, giving no advance notice, he walked across Lafayette Square to St. John's Church and slipped into a back pew unnoticed by most of the congregation. It was where Lincoln had sometimes worshipped, he knew. "Don't think over 6 people recognized me," he wrote in his diary. One evening Admiral Leahy stayed over for dinner, and afterward he and Truman played hosts at a reception for White House employees and their families. But most nights were taken up with work in the upstairs oval study, where the long windows stood open to the mild spring air. From sounds in the night, Truman became convinced the house was haunted and tried to imagine which former residents might be involved. June 12, 1945. Dear Bess, just 2 months ago today I was a reasonably happy and contented vice president. Maybe you can remember that far back, too, but things have changed so much it hardly seems real. I sit here in this old house and work on foreign affairs, read reports, and work on speeches, all the while listening to the ghosts walk up and down the hallway and even right in here in the study. The floors pop and the drapes move back and forth. I can just imagine old Andy and Teddy having an argument over Franklin. Or James Buchanan and Franklin Pierce deciding which was the more useless to the country. And when Millard Fillmore and Chester Arthur join in for place and show, the din is almost unbearable. General Eisenhower made a triumphal return to the city, spoke to a joint session of Congress, and Truman gave a stag dinner for him at the White House, which everyone thought a big success. "He's a nice fellow and a good man," Truman reported to Bess. "He's done a whale of a job." There was talk everywhere of running Eisenhower for president, which Truman told her was perfectly fine by him. "I'd turn it over to him now if I could." Alone in the old house, he would poke about in the closets, adjust the clocks. He hated being by himself, hated having breakfast alone, or even going through the motions of dressing for the day. "I'm always so lonesome when the family leaves. I have no one to raise a fuss over my neckties and my haircuts, my shoes and my clothes generally," he lamented in his diary. "I usually put on a terrible tie not even Bob Hannigan or Ed McKim would wear, just to get a loud protest from Bess and Margie. When they are gone, I have to put on the right ones, and it's no fun." Yet the truth seemed to be that things were going exceedingly, inexplicably well for him. His popularity was beyond imagining. A Gallup poll reported that 87% of the people approved his conduct of the presidency, which was a higher rating even than Roosevelt had ever received. Nor was the woeful man of the evening letters, the one who turned up in the office each day. "And as usual, he is in good humor," Eben Ayers noted one Monday morning. Truman was pleased with his popularity on the Hill, pleased with his press conferences, his staff. He loved having Charlie Ross on duty. Most heartening was the good progress made by Hopkins, who returned from Moscow on June 12th and, with Joseph Davies, came for breakfast the next morning. Davies was back from a mission to London to see Churchill. In long cables from Moscow, Hopkins had given full account of his every conversation with Stalin. Though greatly offended by the manner in which Lend-Lease had been shut off, Stalin seemed willing to let the matter pass. He had agreed even to the American position on voting procedure in the United Nations Security Council, which in effect meant the San Francisco Conference was saved. Churchill, in further cables, had been urging again that there be no withdrawal of American forces to the designated occupation zones in Europe. "Nothing really important has been settled yet," he warned Truman, "and you and I will have to bear great responsibility for the future." But Hopkins told Truman any delay in the withdrawal of American troops from the Soviet zone was certain to be misunderstood by the Russians. Reportedly, General Eisenhower also thought it unwise to keep American forces in the Russian zone. Truman, determined still to do nothing in violation of Roosevelt's agreements at Yalta, and believing this the best possible way to demonstrate America's good faith to the Russians and to induce them to carry out their own obligations in return, informed Churchill on June 11th that, as agreed, American troops would pull back, which Churchill saw as a terrible mistake. A few years later, Truman would write, "We were about 150 miles east of the border of the occupation zone line agreed to at Yalta. I felt that agreements made in the war to keep Russia fighting should be kept, and I kept them to the letter. Perhaps they should not have been adhered to so quickly." Regarding Poland, Stalin had told Hopkins he was willing to talk, all of which meant the issue stood again where it was when Roosevelt came home from Yalta, except that now the place and time for such talk was settled. Truman had wanted to meet in Alaska, but as twice before, for both the Tehran and Yalta conferences, Stalin was granted his way. It would be Potsdam, a Berlin suburb in the zone held by the Red Army. The date chosen was July 15th. Truman was so pleased by what Hopkins had achieved, he even thought Hopkins, whose death-like appearance stunned others at the White House, looked improved in health. The trip had done Hopkins good, Truman felt sure. The Russians, he wrote in his diary, had always been our friends, and I can't see why they shouldn't always be. By leaving his sickbed to go to Moscow, Hopkins had performed heroic service for his country. Truman was enormously grateful to him and thanked him. Hopkins, who had worked so long and closely with Roosevelt, later told Charlie Ross that it was the first time he had ever been thanked by a president. The president was trying to understand what to do in the Pacific, trying to fathom MacArthur, whom he had never met but didn't like from what he had read and heard. Mr. Prima Donna, brass hat, 5-star MacArthur, Truman referred to him in the privacy of his diary. Don't see how a country can produce such men as Robert E. Lee, John J. Pershing, Eisenhower, and Bradley, and at the same time produce Custers, Pattons, and MacArthurs. His mind was on plans for the invasion and a proposed Navy blockade designed to starve Japan into submission. In a memorandum stamped urgent, Admiral Leahy noted the president wanted to know the number of men and ships needed. He wants an estimate of the time required and an estimate of the losses in killed and wounded that will result from an invasion of Japan proper. It is his intention to make his decision on the campaign with the purpose of economizing to the maximum extent possible in the loss of American lives. Economy in the use of time and in money cost is comparatively unimportant. I have to decide Japanese strategy. Shall we invade Japan proper, or shall we bomb and blockade? Truman pondered in his diary. That is my hardest decision to date. S-1 was not mentioned. Nor was it mentioned at the extremely important White House meeting to review the invasion plans the afternoon of Monday, June 18, 1945, and this, as the hour passed, struck one of Stimson's staff, Assistant Secretary of War John J. McCloy, as extremely odd. Things were proceeding, McCloy saw, as if the bomb did not exist. The plan, as presented by General Marshall, was for a two-phase invasion, beginning in November with the southernmost of the Japanese islands, Kyushu, only 350 miles from Okinawa. The operation, said Marshall, would be as difficult as Normandy, but he thought it the only course to pursue. Casualties were hard to predict. He estimated that in the initial phase, the first 30 days only, losses would be similar to those on Luzon, which was about 31,000. Admiral King said Okinawa would be a more realistic measure and put the number at 41,000. Admiral Nimitz would forecast 49,000 casualties in the first 30 days, 7,000 more than at Normandy in an equal span of time. MacArthur's staff estimated 50,000, though MacArthur, who was all for the invasion, considered that too high. Another estimate at the Pentagon included the invasion of both southern and northern Kyushu, as well as Japan proper, the decisive invasion, and the cost of this plan came to 220,000 casualties, nearly 250,000 men. But a memorandum of June 4, 1945, written by General Thomas Handy of Marshall's staff, enlisting the advantages of making peace with Japan, said America would save no less than 500,000 to 1,000,000 lives by avoiding the invasion altogether, which shows that figures of such magnitude were then in use at the highest levels. Stimson was certain the Japanese would fight as never before, soldiers and civilians alike, and that the cost of life on both sides would far exceed all other campaigns of the war. The number of American dead and wounded, Stimson feared, could reach 1,000,000. The code name for the overall plan was Downfall. The assault on Kyushu, called Olympic, was to begin November 1st. Operation Coronet, the larger invasion of Japan proper, the main island of Honshu, would follow in March 1946. Prior to the invasion of Honshu, air bombardment would be increased to an absolute maximum to the point where, said one memorandum, more bombs will be dropped on Japan than were delivered against Germany during the entire European war. Truman approved the plan. McCloy, who had expressed his own views to Stimson at length the night before, kept silent throughout the discussion. But as the meeting ended, he remembered, "We were beginning to get our papers together, and the president saw me. 'McCloy,' he said, 'nobody leaves this room until he's been heard from.' I turned to Stimson, and he said, 'Go ahead.' McCloy replied that the threat of the bomb might provide a political solution. The whole invasion could be avoided. An immediate hush fell on the room, as if the mere mention of the ultra-secret was out of order. I said I would tell them, the Japanese, we have the bomb, and I would tell them what kind of a weapon it is, and then I would tell them the surrender terms. He thought the Japanese should also be told they could keep their emperor. What if they refused, he was asked. Our moral position will be stronger if we give them warning. Truman indicated he would think about it. He flew to San Francisco on the Sacred Cow to speak in the Opera House on June 26th at the official signing of the United Nations Charter. They were there, he told the delegates, to keep the world at peace. And free from the fear of war, he declared emphatically, both hands chopping the air, palms inward, in rhythm with the words free, fear, and war. San Francisco was his first public appearance since becoming president, and the reception the city gave him took his breath away. 1 million people turned out to cheer him as he rode in an open car. A day later, he flew into Kansas City for the first time as president and to the biggest welcome home ever seen in Jackson County. Dad loved every minute of it, remembered Margaret. He was photographed having his hair cut in Frank Spina's barbershop downtown. He dropped in at Eddie Jacobson's Westport Menswear, drank bourbon and swapped stories with Ted Marks, Jim Pendergast, and 7 or 8 others from Battery D after dinner at the home of Independence Mayor Roger Sherman. When he spoke at the huge auditorium of the reorganized Latter-day Saints, every seat was filled. I shall attempt to meet your expectations, he said humbly, but do not expect too much of me. The next day, after receiving an honorary degree from the University of Kansas City, he described how, on the flight from San Francisco, after a stop at Salt Lake City, he had looked down on the Great Plains and thought of his grandfather, Solomon Young. From Kansas City to Salt Lake and home again had taken Solomon Young 3 months each way. Now his grandson had done it in 3.5 hours. I am anxious to bring home to you that the world is no longer county size, no longer state size, no longer nation size, he said. It is a world in which we must all get along. On July 2nd, he went before the Senate to urge ratification of the United Nations Charter. It comes from the reality of experience in a world where one generation has failed twice to keep the peace. With the time for his departure for Berlin fast approaching, he spent longer hours in his office, which looked more as he himself wanted it to look. Everything belonging to Franklin Roosevelt had been removed. A Rembrandt Peale portrait of George Washington, on loan from the National Gallery, hung now to one side of the mantel facing him. On the other side was a portrait of Simón Bolívar, given to him in 1941 by the Venezuelan ambassador. The gift, on behalf of the Venezuelan government, was to the largest community in the United States bearing the name of the great liberator, Bolivar, Missouri. Above the mantel was a Remington entitled Fired On, borrowed from the Smithsonian. It showed Indian fighters on horseback under attack in ghostly green moonlight, one horse rearing violently in the foreground, as Truman's own horse had reared the night in the Vosges Mountains when Battery D was fired on. Roosevelt's naval scenes had been replaced with a series of prints of early airplanes. The Roosevelt portrait remained on the wall to Truman's right. On a table that once held a ship model was a bronze replica of the equestrian Andrew Jackson by Charles Keck that stood in front of the Kansas City courthouse. Behind his desk, on a table in front of the windows, were portraits of Bess, Margaret, and Mama Truman, and a hodgepodge of books. Franklin Roosevelt's desk had been removed, given by Truman to Mrs. Roosevelt, and replaced with a 7-foot walnut desk that had belonged to Theodore Roosevelt. Its surface, by FDR's standards, was bare and tidy. Besides a large green blotter and telephone, there were several pairs of eyeglasses in separate cases, 2 small metal ashtrays for visitors, a model cannon, a clock, 2 pen sets, one fancy, one plain, pencils, date stamp, calendar, 2 magnifying glasses, paste jar, glass inkwell, and a battered old ice-water vacuum pitcher, the one item from among FDR's personal effects that Truman had asked to keep. In a small silver frame was the 1917 photograph of Bess that he had carried with him to France. Another small frame held a motto of Mark Twain's in Twain's own hand. Always do right. This will gratify some people and astonish the rest. There was no buzzer on or beneath the desk. Truman didn't like to buzz people. He would get up and go to the door instead. Further, he ordered the removal of a hidden recording device that Roosevelt had used now and then. To an artist named S.J. Wolfe, sent by the New York Times to do a sketch of the president at work, Truman seemed surprisingly relaxed in view of all that must be on his mind. The responsibilities resting on a president, said Truman, were so heavy that if he were to keep thinking of them and considering what might happen as a result of the decisions he had to make, he would soon go under. Truman was sure the Russians wanted to be friends. He saw no reason why we should not welcome their friendship and give ours to them. He looked forward to meeting both Stalin and Churchill, he said. But to Bess he wrote a feeling blue as indigo about going. Henry Stimson, who had attended neither of the previous Big Three conferences, had not been invited to make the trip. This was out of consideration for his health, Truman told him. Acutely aware of how much could hang on last-minute developments concerning S-1, Stimson chose to invite himself. He would go by plane, arriving in Berlin in advance of the president. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau was also extremely eager to be included and extremely upset when he found he was not. Morgenthau had a plan to strip Germany of all heavy industry and reduce it to an agricultural land, an idea Truman had never taken seriously and that Stimson ardently opposed on the grounds that an economically strong and productive Germany was the only hope for the future stability of Europe. Punish her war criminals in full measure, Stimson advised Truman, deprive her permanently of her weapons, guard her governmental action until the Nazi-educated generation has passed from the stage. But do not deprive her of the means of building up ultimately a contented Germany interested in non-militaristic methods of civilization. It had also been pointed out to Truman that if some unfortunate mishap were to occur on the trip to Berlin, and he and Secretary of State Burns were both to die, then, as the law of succession stood, Henry Morgenthau would become president, a thought that distressed Truman exceedingly. But whether this was because Morgenthau was a Jew, the reason Morgenthau suspected, is not indicated in anything Truman said or wrote. Morgenthau came to see him in the Oval Office on July 5th to say, according to Truman's account of the meeting, that it was essential that he, Morgenthau, play a part at Potsdam, and that if he could not, he would resign. If such was the case, said Truman, then his resignation was accepted at once. The announcement was made the same day. To replace Morgenthau at Treasury, Truman named Fred M. Vinson, who had served 14 years in Congress, where he was considered an expert on fiscal matters, and 5 years as a judge on the Circuit Court of Appeals before being named by Roosevelt to head the Office of Economic Stabilization and later the Office of War Mobilization and Reconversion. Vinson was a versatile, diligent public figure, if unimpressive in appearance. With his receding chin, the dark circles under his eyes, he had a weary hound dog look. He was also an affable, old-style Kentucky politician, down-to-earth, humorous, shrewd, and in Truman's estimate one of the best men in government. In his own diary account of the breakup, Morgenthau made no mention of the Potsdam issue, only that Truman seemed very weak and indecisive about whether he wanted Morgenthau to stay on the job until the war ended. According to Morgenthau, he told Truman, "Either you want me to stay until VJ Day or you don't. After all, Mr. President, I don't think it is conceited to say that I am at least as good or better as some of the 5 new people you appointed in the cabinet, and on some of them I think you definitely made a mistake." A number of years later, in a conversation with Jonathan Daniels, Truman would say, "Morgenthau didn't know shit from apple butter." "I'm getting ready to go see Stalin and Churchill," he wrote to his mother and sister. "I have to take my tuxedo, tails, Negro preacher coat, high hat, low hat, and hard hat. I have a briefcase filled up with information on past conferences and suggestions on what I'm to do and say. Wish I didn't have to go. How I hate this trip," he wrote again in his diary on Sunday, July 7th, on board the cruiser Augusta, underway to Europe once more for the first time since 1918.